Now, Kraut has for a very long time been considered one of the dumbest people to ever talk about race, but I think Vaush is in contention for that title. A friend of mine put up a poll on his Twitter, and I will link to it. I know most of you have seen my exchanges with Kraut, and so you may be biased towards Kraut being the king of this, but hopefully in this video, I will convince you that Vaush is, in fact, dumber than Kraut. There are several things he said which I think are dumber than anything Kraut has ever said, but this is a long video, so without further ado, let's get right into it.
In the sense that races don't exist out in like the ether, it obviously has to be defined by humans, but it obviously corresponds to phenotype and genetic clusters.
Well, the genetic clusters that I've read tend to correlate more to one's environment. For example, West Africans who have their sickle cell shit, like the stuff to prevent sickle cell anemia, those genetic advantages seem to disappear when those people were brought over on slave ships and kept in our country for a few hundred years. Even if they're pure black, never race mixed with a white person, these advantages, with people often considered to be like a racial characteristic, reveal themselves to be an environmental one.
Now, sickle cell disease is one of the most commonly used examples of a simple Mendelian trait in introductory genetics classes. I took some basic genetics classes back in college, and this was one of the first examples they bring up to illustrate dominant and recessive inheritance. I'm pretty sure this is also taught in high school biology. Now, Vaush is correct in saying that the incidence of sickle cell disease is lower in North America than in Africa. In fact, Wikipedia describes it here. Quote, "In the United States, with no endemic malaria, the prevalence of sickle cell anemia among people of African ancestry is lower, about 0.25%, than among people in West Africa, about 4%, and is falling. Without endemic malaria, the sickle cell mutation is purely disadvantageous and tends to decline in the affected population by natural selection, and now artificially through prenatal genetic screening. However, the African American community descends from a significant admixture of several African and non-African ethnic groups, and also represents the descendants of survivors of slavery and the slave trade. Thus, a degree of genetic dilution via crossbreeding with non-African people and high health selective pressure through slavery, especially the slave trade and the frequently deadly Middle Passage, may be the most plausible explanations for the lower prevalence of sickle cell anemia and possibly other genetic diseases among African Americans compared to West Africans. Another factor that limits the spread of sickle cell genes in North America is the relative absence of polygamy, which allows affected males to continue to produce many children with multiple partners." So, Wikipedia is describing genetic differences that cause a lower expression of sickle cell disease in American, particularly North American blacks. One is European admixture, as US blacks are about 20% European by admixture, and the allele for sickle cell trait is recessive, and it is almost non-existent in Western European populations, and any European admixture will thus exponentially reduce the expression of sickle cell disease. And since malaria doesn't exist to anywhere near the degree in the US South as it did in equatorial Africa, the cost of sickle cell relative to the benefits were greater than in equatorial Africa. It wasn't worth it as much in the US South, or so this Wikipedia article is saying. Now, the reasons for the genetic change in the African population, which incidentally is an example of evolution occurring very fast, the reasons for that appear to be more open to investigation, as this part of the wiki article appears to be somewhat speculative. But the idea that sickle cell is not a purely genetic trait, this is profound. This is the kind of like poundy fisty, ham-brained pushing to just like pushing to some sort of conclusion fast and just shutting down issues, not leaving things open, not allowing topics to be left in superposition going, what possible reason could it be? I don't know. You don't know, so there is none. And it's just like lead brained. It's just I can't even. It's just, I can't even. And it's what these people like him, they generally do. They just move to conclusion. They move to jam down so fast. No time to think. No time to go over anything. Live debate. Live argument. Answer now, right? And so as a result, all you have are these very fuzzy, ill-formed ideas that are snapped into absolutes, and then they're deeply believed. And the result of this kind of behavior is that you end up saying shit like, sickle cell disease is not genetic. When you're saying this shit live, like, you don't have time to think any of this through. Like, for example, if we don't know the reason something evolved, then genetic traits can't exist. We have to know the reason it happened. It's retarded. But when you're just saying stuff that comes right into your head on the fly, that's what ends up happening. And there may be several reasons why, sickle cell trait is lower among African Americans than West Africans. And the reasons may have been different at different times. Let's not fall to the fallacy of single cause. This sickle cell thing is just a prime example of, like, the problem with Vaush.
Controlled for environment.
Like I said, the sickle cell shit in West Africa, environment seems to cause a change in ones. No, controlling for environment. My contention is that basically everything going on genetically, everything going on under the surface.
Well, I think Vaush should edit the Wikipedia article on this. Get in touch with those guys. I mean, learning that sickle cell is a product of histone rotation and methylation and not a simple genetic trait, that's a bombshell. Especially since the wiki article doesn't refer to epigenetics at all. Now, I know Vaush will try to weasel his way out of this. He'll try to say he wasn't saying exactly what he said. But what's interesting is that even though when talking about data that came from Michael Woodley's Is Homo Sapien Polytypic, he says, I'm not a biologist, so I can't comment about this.
Whichever of the three, measures of diversity you want here, they're all roughly the same, between 0.7 and 0.76, right?
All right, I don't know. I'm not a biologist. I can't engage with biological research.
Let's say there's
Well, does Vaush suddenly become a biologist when he says sickle cell isn't genetic but is epigenetic? No, of course not. But then he says he's talking about sickle cell disease being epigenetic because he's just citing consensus. The consensus is that sickle cell is not genetic but epigenetic, the product of environmental effects that modify the way genes are expressed.
In reality, the racial divisions that we see are pretty much entirely phenotypical. And this has been affirmed through biological study after biological study. All right, I don't know. I'm not a biologist. I can't engage with biological research. I'm not trying to be mean, but this is literally like settled science. Like the variation thing, there's so little genetic difference underneath the skin. It's really almost all phenotypical, and what remains is almost entirely environmental.
They're not genetic, they're phenotypical.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
Or almost entirely phenotypical, says Vaush, and that means not genetic. Now, buddy Vaush, have I got news for you. Race differences aren't almost entirely phenotypical. The observed race differences that you see in people, from the skin color to the hair texture to personality traits, those differences are 100% phenotypical. And what I just told you there is that phenotypic differences are 100% phenotypical, because phenotype just means the characteristics of the organism. Phenotypic variance can be the result of either an underlying genetic difference or some environmental difference. However, the day-to-day, like what we see in terms of differences between any organisms is like what we see is the phenotype, okay? And so phenotypic differences are 100% phenotypical. Again, this is just a bizarre level of ignorance of basic terminology. I didn't spend as much time on this, but I think this is like as big of a tell of low intelligence as the sickle cell thing. And this puts anything Kraut said to shame. Kraut said some dumb stuff, and there's not as much to say about this phenotype stuff, but I think this might be dumber than what he said about sickle cell, and it's certainly dumber than anything Kraut said about race. Because think about it. Kraut said something about trout getting pregnant, which was wrong. But, you know, there's various species of fish that get pregnant. That's a mistake that could be understood. Whereas believing that sickle cell is not genetic, that's something unique. Like, how do you do that? That's like somebody playing a video game and getting killed in a way. Is like, how do you even... Like, I couldn't even do that if I tried. Like, if I was trying to be stupid, that's not something I would do. Because, like, if you're really stupid and you just sort of believe whatever the dumb authorities tell you to believe, you will believe that sickle cell is a genetic trait. But to believe it's not a genetic trait, that's like I don't even know, that's like a level of stupid is like, how do you even do that? Whereas believing trout get pregnant, I can understand it. There's plenty of fish that do get pregnant, so maybe believing trout get pregnant, sure, whatever. Kraut also went around parroting a bunch of race denial arguments, a bunch of IQ. These old arguments from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that have been long refuted. The field itself doesn't take them seriously, but it's, you know, I can understand why Kraut would come to believe a lot of the stuff that he says, but Vaush is doing he's like TASBot, but sucking. Like, he is like TAS level of suckage. And it was funny, you know, Vaush had Kraut on his show, and I think Vaush believes he's smarter than Kraut, or he thinks that Kraut made some royally bad arguments of a caliber that he wouldn't make. But both of these things, you know, race differences are almost entirely phenotypic, and sickle cell isn't genetic, both of these things are dumber than anything Kraut has said.
Affirming that there is almost no genetic variance between the average white and black person, and that there's more variance between a white person and an average white person than there would be between an average white person and an average black person. Genetically, we all seem to be pretty much the same. It's just a cone of paint.
That's not true at all. You think there's more genetic variance between two white people than there would be a white person and a black person?
Yeah, the whiteness actually encompasses a...
Holy shit. Holy shit. This isn't even like... This isn't even. I'll just leave it there. This isn't even. Okay, but seriously, this isn't even what actual race deniers say. Okay, first, let me tell you what the actual argument is you Vaush, what you're trying to say, but you're failing, you're mangling this argument. So first, let me organize this argument and present the argument that you're trying to make properly, and then I'll tell you why it's wrong. But you didn't even make the argument properly, okay? Their claim comes from a misreading of what FST distance means. Their claim is that if a random white guy and a random black guy, that you, a white person, will have a roughly 42.5% chance of being more genetically similar to the black guy than to the white guy. Okay? That's what they're saying. They're not saying that you're more likely to be more genetically similar to a black person than you are to a white person if you're white. Now, in before Vaush lies and say he meant something else by this, he did not. All right? It was very clear what he said. The reason this is dumb is because this argument is based on the people who make this, who are, you know, PhDs and doctorates and professors at universities, that they're not taking into account cumulative probability, right? These masters of their craft, masters of their field, people who are, you know, put in positions of authority and power and teaching of hundreds of people, they are ignorant of the basic concept known as cumulative probability. What that FST distance means is that at any given gene location, 15% of the variance is within population, 85% is between the populations. So you're more likely to share an allele with a white guy than a black guy 57.5% of the time on average at any one gene location. But there are roughly 23,000 genes. So using 100 genes, the probability that you will be more similar to the white person, to a random white person, than to a random black person on 51 of those genes is around 92%. If you use 200 genes, the odds that you will be more similar to the white person than the black person on 101 genes, right, just getting over 50%, the odds of that, of being closer to the white person, is 98%. By 1,000 genes, it's basically 100%. This is done with simple binomial probability calculation. So that's the actual argument which Vaush mangled, and also why the unmangled version of that argument is false. And I say this, and the average viewer will think what I just said here is ridiculous, and they'll become incredulous of what I'm saying here because it seems too brazen. This seems too stupid that, you know, really smart, you know, the funny hat people would so regularly make this argument, because you've probably heard this before, and you've probably heard it from people with lots of credentials repeating this argument, and it seems too brazen that these really quote-unquote smart people would say something this stupid, and not just stupid, but in a rather simple way, just not understanding cumulative probability. It's too obvious. It would almost be easier if their error was more sophisticated, because then it would be more believable that these smart people could make an error sort of down in the details. And I think it's because this error here is so simplistic that people have a hard time believing me, because there's no way that the funny hats could be this stupid. And I think a similar thing sort of happened with Taleb. It seems too much. It seems like it would have been easier if my critique of Taleb was more sophisticated. That if Taleb had made a more sophisticated error, but it's almost that the error is so simple and so stupid that it's hard for like the average Joe who has some sort of a faith in the academy to believe that these people would be this dumb. And of course, I'll talk later in this video about some of the real-world proficiencies of people with postgraduate education. For example, the average black person with a postgraduate degree in the U.S., which of course includes Harvard and also like Central Oklahoma College or whatever. It's the average of all universities in the U.S., but the average black person with a postgraduate degree cannot read and make sense of a bus schedule. Right? That's something to keep in mind when thinking about the value of these postgraduate credentials. These people are not as smart as you think they are, and these credentials don't mean what they used to mean.
Even if we ignore the fact, by the way, that IQ has been proven to be racially biased in terms of how culturally it responds.
No, I can
contesting a very, very well
contest that right off the bat.
Point?
Yeah, it's Reeve and Charles. It's a 2008 study.
Sure.
It's behind a paywall, unfortunately.
Oh, nice. The literal first 2 articles that come up are from the alternative hypothesis, a known lying Nazi. Nice. But, I mean, I'm not saying that makes this study invalid. I would cite the argument from the research that I have read that IQ tests do tend to have racial bias, because there are a lot of cultural elements that are brought about, that are invoked in IQ tests, that people of different races, or people of different environments, may have different levels of intrinsic understanding of.
But Vaush just asserts there are studies showing test bias, doesn't cite anything, claims there exist meta-analyses proving test bias, and just hand waves away the consensus on this. No, Vaush, this is real, and the people you rely on for information on this topic are wrong. One thing that's not considered is that the test bias might be slightly in favor of blacks, probably in Hispanics, but more likely in favor of blacks. What I mean is that IQ tests tend to overpredict black performance on any particular task, which is to say, the real evidence of racial bias on IQ tests is that they are slightly biased against whites, that they underpredict white performance in tasks. Or to put it another way, blacks at least do better on IQ tests than they do in university or in military field tasks than their ASVAB score would predict. And ASVAB functions as an IQ test. It's about as G-loaded as an IQ test. It can be used as a proxy for. In addition to the predictive validity for test bias, there's also an expert panel that was done. This was done back in the 1980s. They took a bunch of supposed experts, gave them some commonly used IQ tests, Wechsler, Stanford, Binet, I believe, and asked them to rate what they thought were the most culturally biased questions on that test. And the result, of course, was the exact opposite. There was an inverse correlation between what the researchers thought were culturally biased questions and the magnitude of the racial gaps. And this is what you would in fact predict if you understood the pattern of racial gaps on IQ tests. Arithmetic and verbal questions produce lower gaps than do visual, spatial, and highly abstract questions. Things like inferring the patterns of an unfolding cube, recreating a building with a series of blocks, or predicting the next picture in a pattern of shapes. These are actually what have larger racial gaps than, say, verbal or arithmetic questions. Right, which all ties in with genetic G and the fact that the more heritable subtests have larger racial gaps, and the subtests that are more impacted by environment, they have smaller racial gaps. And the magnitude of this is to such a degree that would imply an 80% heritability of the overall IQ gap, the overall nominal IQ gap, not necessarily of G. Now, I'm not putting this forward as some key argument here. The way we know the tests aren't biased is because of predictive validity. That basically settles it. The experiment with experts in 1982 looking at specific questions and seeing if there was more bias on questions they considered racially biased, that's just icing on the cake. However, Vaush and people like him with a more authoritarian view of knowledge, they want to know what socially defined experts think. Well, we have 2 large surveys on intelligence researchers, one from 2008 by Reeve and Charles. And of those who answered the question, are the tests racially biased, 84.6% of intelligence researchers agreed that tests were not racially biased, and 63.6% of applied psychologists in the survey who answered agreed that the tests are not racially biased. There was another one done in 2003 by Murphy, Cronin, and Tam, and they only looked at intelligence researchers who were part of the American Psychological Association, specifically the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. And of those who responded to the question on test bias, 81.5% agreed that tests were not biased. 2008 was 11 years ago, but the trend from 2003 to 2008 seems to be flat, if not in the direction of more rejection of test bias. I should also add that not only is test bias not believed by people who study such things, but it is not believed even by mainstream academic racists either. For example, Kevin Drum, in his article Denying Divergent Evolution in Humans, even he recognizes that there's no evidence of cultural bias on IQ tests. So what Vaush doesn't realize is saying IQ tests are culturally biased is actually an extreme view among people who know about this topic. Now, among racists and sort of modern Nazi analogs, yes, this is a big talking point for you. You guys think IQ tests are biased in favor of Jews as a way to legitimize Jewish supremacy in German institutions. Or maybe that was the Nazis. I guess for you it's to justify the domination of the capitalists and the bourgeois. Or maybe that's the Soviets. White people. For you, it's white people who are the problem, and that's why you deny the research on this, and that's why you say things like the tests are biased in favor of the bad group. And this is an important episode here because it shows that Vaush doesn't necessarily know what academic consensus is, even when he confidently proclaims that he does, and confidently proclaims that anybody who refutes him on what academic consensus actually is, he just calls them a Nazi. Source denial. Now, this is something Vaush does that sort of calls into question the whole purpose of his show. He calls Michael Woodley a Nazi, he calls Emil Kierkegaard a Nazi, I'm sure he calls Rushton and Jensen and Richard Lynn Nazis, and of course he calls me a Nazi, and he keeps citing like Rational Wiki articles. So, Irish laddie, why don't you just skip the pretense and just jump up and down and declare yourself always correct, and that any argument that contradicts you is Nazi, therefore wrong. Tag Nazi, therefore wrong, therefore dismiss argument, dismiss data. What's the point of you pretending to interact with these people if any journal or any researcher who contradicts your environmental determinism is just tagged Nazi and then hand waved away? And again, this is another thing Kraut was never stupid enough to do. Kraut was never so stupid as to make the test bias argument. So this is a third, or maybe we're on I don't know what we're on, but this is another argument that Vaush made that is dumber than anything Kraut said. Again, there have been 2 general surveys on the intelligence views of researchers in the West, and one of the questions was their view of the black-white gap, views which I think can be reasonably extrapolated onto all other racial gaps, but both of these surveys came up with medians around 50% heritability. Now, on this question, I'm at 80%. So I'm over here. I'm towards the higher end of this scale, and I'll defend it, I'll argue it, and I'll say why I think the credentialed experts who think it's 50% are wrong on this question. So I'm somewhat heterodox, fair enough. But I'm not as heterodox as Vaush. Now, That doesn't necessarily mean Vaush is wrong. Vaush could know some things that could totally upend everything we think on this. But Vaush is trying to say that his position on this is mainstream when it's just not. And when looking at race denial, the denial of biological races in humans, defined as subspecies or any other taxonomic division, Vaush claims race denial is a mainstream academic viewpoint, but among whom? Among sociologists, probably, but among physical anthropologists in the West, it's about 1/3 recognized biological races. In the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries, it's about 2/3 recognized biological races, and in China, it's virtually unanimous. Among biologists, there are no general surveys on this question that I know of, or that I know of recently, but biologists in the 1970s and 1980s were always about 10% more likely than physical anthropologists to recognize biological races in humans. Animal biologists, interestingly enough, were the most likely subgroup of biologists to recognize races in humans. And I suspect it's because animal biologists were the ones most likely to see the parallels between recognized subspecies in other mammals and in humans. And in addition, in terms of new physical anthropologists, there is no trend towards increased race denial in the West, and there is no trend toward increased race denial in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And I'll link to my article on this that describes in more detail and links out to the papers that I'm talking about. So the net of people that Vaush has to throw out and call Nazi and dismiss, this is far larger than he realizes. These are large sections of the globe, and it may be a bitter pill for him to realize that while at whatever university he was at, he was in a bubble and wasn't told the truth about what relevant academics worldwide actually believe about race. That all those epiphanies you thought you had were false epiphanies. In addition, the kinds of people who were telling you to deny divergent evolution probably never imagined that you would actually interact with someone who knew what they were talking about. Because in the university, did you ever have somebody who would bust your balls in the way I'm doing here? Did you ever have somebody who would make fun of you, who would point out to what kind of a cosmic idiot you are for saying the race differences are almost entirely phenotypic. Sickle cell is not genetic, it's epigenetic. Now, maybe you'll lie and say that you did have some pushback, but we all know that you didn't. Okay, you know this, I know this. Anyone in the audience who went to a university knows this because we've been there. We know what that is. You're not going to pull one over on this. And I think a problem is that Vaush was presented studies and presented interpretations of them by sociologists and by people he trusted when he was between the ages of 18 and 22, when he was a kid. And this experience is worse than knowing nothing about the topic because he developed a vague confidence in a non-existent consensus simply because he interpreted what he was being told by his professors as the consensus, not knowing that this thing that was presented as consensus to him was actually a fringe view. Or perhaps he just believed them when they told them whatever they told them, and then he sort of imagined that what they were saying was consensus. Now for me, all this chatter is kind of irrelevant because I just read lots of papers, and consensus is a heuristic for people who don't understand much about a topic. The more you read, the more things get into focus and you begin to deviate from consensus. If it were up to me, I wouldn't have spent any time looking into any of this research on what academics actually believe about race. I would just look at the arguments themselves, and that's 99% of what I actually do. I present this stuff on surveys of believed relevant experts simply as a way of getting past this, of getting to argument, because I just want to argue the argument. And I have to talk about this, though, because Vaush uses his mythical consensus as a way to jam down any evidence for divergent evolution in humans. I just want to bypass consensus games and also credential games, which we'll get into later, altogether and just argue the arguments. So this is a hard argument to make, not from a lack of facts, as the facts are overwhelming. It's a hard argument to make because American conservatives have been saying it, and they've been saying it so badly. so badly that they have immunized from any parallels between the Nazi regime and the modern coalition of surrounding the Democrat Party, vaguely. This video is already going to be incredibly long, and I want to get this out sometime this century, so I'm going to outsource this to two people that I know. One is our good buddy Sean Last, and for the credentialists, he has credentials. And the other is Kremio, a German speaker who I won't say anything else about. So, from Sean Last, quote, "Of all the things Nazi Germany has come to be erroneously associated with, none is more absurd than racial science. Nazi Germany stands out as being unusually opposed to empirical, naturalistic, racial science, at a time when many Western nations were in favor of it. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the evolutionary and racial thinking which took hold in Germany had a metaphysical and anti-positivist bent. I don't know that there is a systematic way of demonstrating this, so what I have elected to do is briefly point to a few thinkers who I believe exemplify this trend. Arthur de Gobineau was an important racial thinker who seems to have been an important source of the Nazis' conviction that the rise and fall of civilizations was largely a function of the degradation of the genetic quality of populations. Gobineau spent a great deal of time justifying this belief, but did not rely on empirical evidence to do so. Gobineau was part of a romantic intellectual tradition as opposed to the application of scientific methodology in the humanities. Ernst Haeckel popularized evolutionary theory in the German-speaking world. Haeckel was a great biologist, but he was also famously not held down by the facts. He would speculate about all manner of things, ranging from cell chemistry that was not yet observable to species which no one knew of, but which he thought would someday be discovered. Moreover, he had a tendency to blend science with metaphysics and regard evolution as an all-encompassing theory which could explain all of nature rather than just biology. Houston Stewart Chamberlain was another key thinker in the development of Nazi racial thought. Born British, he would eventually become a naturalized German citizen and a German supremacist, marry Wagner's daughter, have his birthday celebrated as a holiday in Germany, and become an early member of the Nazi Party. Chamberlain was an important proponent of the idea that civilizational success was largely a function of the degree to which a civilization was managed by Aryans, and that the degradation of Aryan bloodlines, and therefore civilizations, was often the fault of Jews. Chamberlain was also an advocate of a moral definition of race whereby he labeled Jesus, Shakespeare, and Dante, among others, quote-unquote Germans. Chamberlain was radically anti-positivist and regarded over-reliance on science to be one of the greatest problems with the thinking of his time. It is worth noting that the German and non-German speaking world had increasingly divergent schools of thought following the Second World War. This was evident when, for instance, Germans were barred from attending the Second International Eugenics Conference of 1921, an event which was attended by Winston Churchill and Herbert Hoover, and in the 1930s, population geneticists in America helped form organizations which denounced Nazi uses and understandings of racial science. An especially clear area of difference between the German and Anglo world concerns IQ testing. The most important people in the early development of intelligence testing were probably Francis Galton, Charles Spearman, Alfred Binet, and Louis Terman. Now, just my personal note, Sean says probably these people because Sean is being very precise and not wanting to be, because there may have been someone before these people, but Francis Galton was sort of the real popularizer of IQ tests in the same way that like Doom and Wolfenstein popularized first-person shooters. So he may not have been the very, very, very first, but he was the guy who basically popularized the idea of psychometrics. Continuing. By the First World War, the American military was mass administering IQ tests. By the Second World War, IQ testing was being utilized in schools in America, England, and France. By contrast, the Nazis did not trust IQ testing. Hans Eysenck, a psychologist who grew up in Nazi Germany, recalls that psychometrically valid intelligence tests were banned under the Third Reich. On page 16 of his 1979 book, The Structure and Measurement of Intelligence, he wrote, quote, Stalin, as already noted, banned intelligence testing for being bourgeois, and Hitler did the same because it was Jewish. Some people will be surprised to hear this, as it is often said that the Nazis used IQ tests to determine who to sterilize as part of the eugenics program. Nicholas McIntosh clears this up on page 20 of his book, IQ and Human Intelligence. Quote, German doctors did indeed cobble together a few questions. Who is Bismarck? Who discovered America? Which they would put to those suspected of mental disability, but they regarded the results of such tests with skepticism, especially when it was found that they failed to discriminate between normal and backward children in East Prussia, and that far too many members of the Nazi Party were unable to give the correct answers. Doctors were more likely to rely on their impressions of the victim's behavior at the interview, and their interest in moral feeble-mindedness resulted in many of these questions being superseded by ones asking why people pray or why you should tell the truth. Clearly, these are not the sort of well-validated intelligence tests used in the English-speaking world and relied heavily on subjective impressions of doctors. Nazis did use tests for intelligence, but they were not the sort of thing that people commonly refer to when they talk about IQ tests. Eugenics is also commonly associated with Nazi Germany. Eugenics as a term was coined by Francis Galton, British. The related school of thought called social Darwinism was headed by Herbert Spencer, British, and of course, Darwin himself was British. Eugenics programs were set up in the United States before the Nazi state even existed. In between the two world wars, the most important eugenicist thinker was Madison Grant, an American whose work Hitler referred to as his Bible. Eugenics was an idea that the Nazis embraced, but it was not one they thought up. Rather, it was a set of ideas adopted from the English-speaking world. Given this, the idea that English-speaking people have rejected eugenics in part because of its associated with Nazism should be seen as nothing but the work of rank propaganda. Now, from Cremu, I don't know how to pronounce French words, I'm sorry. He says, quote, contrary to Turkheimer's insinuation, the Nazis vehemently opposed the Galton-Spearman tradition. They preferred a Jungian, typological, and Volkish conception of intelligence, more akin to Gardner's multiple intelligences or Sternberg's triarchic abilities. Just an aside for the viewer, if you want to know more about multiple intelligences, you can go to the Alternative Hypothesis and search for the article on multiple intelligences where I talk about Gardner's crap. Continuing. In fact, the arguments of Gould, Lewontin, Rose, Kamen, Sternberg, and Gardner are hardly distinguishable from those made by prominent Nazi psychologists. Few, if any, Nazis considered themselves to be concerned primarily with mental measurement. This was bourgeois. Given that I'm a native German speaker, I can read sources on this that Turkheimer may be unaware of. Erich Rudolf Jansch and Friedrich Becker offer an excellent description of Nazi views towards intelligence and group differences. From their writing, we can see that the Nazis believed intelligence research represented the victory of a bourgeois spirit, that intelligence measurement, especially with a predominant general factor a la Spearman, like the G factor, was an instrument for Jewry to, quote, fortify its hegemony over white Gentiles, that the use of intelligence testing in schools was a system of examination of Jewish origin, etc., almost exactly like Sternberg, and more recently people like Nassim Taleb. The Nazis claimed that, because people differ and thus intelligence differs, there should be examinations not for intellectualism, quote-unquote, but for practical intelligence. The Nazis claimed that correlation and factor analysis were invalid tools for understanding anything, compared this to Hilgard, 1955, correlation is an instrument of the devil, and that even if a general factor emerged from ability tests, it was invalid. That life was more complex than a dominant general factor, a fact no one contests, and that regardless of what the results showed, they would be unconvincing, because understanding is always distant, multifaceted, complex. In Volkmar Weiss's German words, he records that the Nazis rejected IQ tests. If they had accepted them, they would have had to admit that the Jews outperformed Germans and that Slavs performed very similarly to Germans. This is completely inconsistent with what Turkheimer implies and with the apparently popular view that the Nazis cherished and frequently used IQ tests. When it came to group differences in humans, the Nazis were pragmatic nihilists capable of denying evidence when it suited their agenda, like Turkheimer. The disdain for the bourgeois displayed by the Nazis was shared by their intellectual successors, Lewontin et al., with the same collectivistic impulse. Both groups attacked the individualistic G-based Galton-Spearman-Jensen paradigm. The first articulations of the criticisms of intelligence brought forward by pop intellectuals like Gould et al. Were made by the Nazis. This includes opposition to reification and certain types of accusation of class bias. Exchanging the terms 1% or dominant class, or white people, for Jews would make it impossible to distinguish their arguments. The censure of Luria by the communists for his interest in intelligence is yet another example of the totalitarian, this time communist, opposition to this sort of research. French words. The Nazis also believed much of the Jewish-Gentile difference to be the result of environments, not genes. The Nazis were typological thinkers when it came to anthropology, but types were often the result of the environment. Certain types of education, they believed, would make Germans more like Jews. In Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, he mentions a blackguarding type being an indelible blemish from his cramped home environment. Hitler believed that by improvement of Germans' rearing environments, these blackguards could be precluded from existing without a single shot being fired. Similarly, the Nazis believed that Jewish children could be re-educated away from their Jewishness. Heredity was secondary for the Nazis. Lothrop Stotter's trip to the Nazi eugenics courts in Into the Darkness is an almost farcical illustration of this fact. Many young Jewish children were forcefully adopted into German families out of the Nazi belief in the impotence of heredity and the fluidity of the mind. Now, much of this is a bitter pill to swallow, but ask yourself, how much do you really know about Nazi views on heredity and psychometrics? Another thing you may think is that, well, it seems like a lot of academics say this, so they must have at one point looked it up and proved some sort of link between Western hereditarianism and Nazi racial thinking because they say it so much. And unfortunately, this is a problem that I have in ever trying to convince anyone of heterodox views. There's this wall of faith in sort of establishment mantras, whatever the establishment happens to be at their place and time in history. Obviously, if they're in China, their view of what is the norm, what is established fact, what is establishment knowledge, is going to be radically different from what is establishment viewed norm ideas in the US today. And the views in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact are sort of in between those two. But if you live in sort of the NATO sphere, you're dealing with a kind of pan-NATO establishment, and you have faith in what they say generally. Moreover, the conflation between Western racial views with Nazi racial views, or even the conflation of white identity with Nazi race theories, this didn't come about until well after World War II. The conflation of white identity with Nazism came entirely as a result of George Lincoln Rockwell and the American Nazi Party. Before this, nobody ever imagined Nazism had anything to do with pan-European white nationalism. How could it? The Nazis went around killing a bunch of white people and would have consigned roughly 1/3 of them to marginalization or extermination, depending on how exactly their quote-unquote general plan was carried out. And in practice, the Nazi regime allied with Japan and to a limited degree allied with Muslims within the British Empire, and even tried to form an alliance with Turkey and Persia. In fact, Persia had to be invaded by the UK and the USSR to prevent them from shipping oil to the Nazis or anything else, as that regime had sympathies to the Nazis. When you read about the totalitarian regimes in history, and you don't have to dig very deeply, in fact, there's no point, because what makes them tick, what makes them appeal to the public is necessarily simple, and what they all have in common is a revenge ideology. This is why calling these regimes some sort of wing is retarded. It's also why calling anti-whites left-wing, that's retarded. The Nazi example is illustrative. You have these tests showing Jews to be more intelligent, or at least scoring higher, than non-Jewish Germans. And they show Slavic scores to be similar to Germans, just like they do today. This isn't supposed to be, and of course these tests, I guess they justify Jewish power, and so these tests must be thrown out. If the Nazis went by the test results, they would consider perhaps Jewish success was a function of Jewish merit, and that would have diffused their conflict somewhat. I'm not saying IQ denial was central to the German regime, but it was a symptom. And I'm going to use a boomer conservative word here. It was a symptom of victim politics. We Germans are the victims of these terrible things. They weren't. The Treaty of Versailles was a joke, and Germany didn't hardly pay any of it anyway. And they lost some land in Europe, oh well, and they lost their colonies, which was actually a benefit to them. And go watch my video defending France's strategy in World War II for more exposition on this sort of stuff. But they weren't put upon, and neither was Japan. The Japanese had this mythology that they were being denied an empire by the West, when in reality, their imperial holdings of Korea, Manchuria, and Taiwan were certainly more valuable than the possessions that the United States had, or Spain had, or Germany and Italy had at the time. But both Germany and Japan constructed these narratives that they were being oppressed by the Western powers. And in an interstate context, this ultimately led to war between states, with Germany in a somewhat more roundabout way. But had Germany decided to count their blessings and not their curses and had become aligned with the West, they certainly wouldn't have tried to invade Poland. Of course, you look at the Bolsheviks and the Maoists, they push a victim and revenge ideology all the way through. Their beef is against a word salad of baddies: landlords, capitalists, monarchs, foreign countries intervening to insert control over China, foreign countries intervening in the Russian Civil War to reinstate the Tsar. And when I say all these totalitarian ideologies are motivated by revenge narratives, like, what else could that possibly be? What else could they possibly be motivated by? What else could you whip up the masses to do? Very few people are ever actually persuaded by some supremacist doctrine. Yes, you can point to some inner circle Nazi types and some inner circle Japanese types who believe that that Germans were superior or Japanese were racially superior. And who knows, maybe even the masses believe that. But in terms of animating them to do stuff, in order to get someone to do something horrible to someone else, they must be convinced that these other people did something terrible or would do something terrible. And so a characteristic of totalitarian groups is that they have a word salad of isms, all these bad isms that they use to smear a target. And then they say, it's okay to kill this guy, he's a czarist, he's a Nazi. Today, sort of conflating Imperial Japan with Maoist China, with the Soviet Union, with Nazi Germany, this seems like radical, but one common term for the SS in the mid-30s was that they were, when they wore brown shirts, was that they were beefsteaks, that they were brown on the outside and red on the inside. And early on, one of the favorite type of people the Nazis liked to recruit were communists. Himmler particularly targeted communists for conversion. And so this hard break that people have in their mind between doctrines of Imperial Japan and what motivated Germans to do what they did, between that and the Soviet Union and that and Mao, this is something that came as after the war. This was a post-war phenomenon. Before the war, both the West considered Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to have some similar bents to them. Right? They refer to them both as totalitarian. And it wasn't completely unbelievable that they would have a military alliance against the West. Both were aggrieved parties believed to be put upon by the West, along with Japan, believed itself to be an aggrieved party put upon by the West. Same with Italy. The West being at this point France, the UK, the US, and Canada and Anzac. Of course, France got knocked out pretty early. And I think what this really just comes down to, and it's really stupid, is just the fact that that Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and they fought such a terrible, terrible war. I think that's really it. I mean, it's stupid, it's retarded to say, oh, the ideologies must have been radically different because, look, they fought a war against each other. But at root, these were both totalitarian regimes fueled by an ideology of revenge that justified to themselves doing all the horrible things they did to the people they did horrible things to. Now, in the US, who's pushing a victim ideology with a goal of revenge? Who's pushing for reparations? It's not the conservatives. It's not the so-called alt-right. The Nazis denied IQ tests because they were Jewish. Stalin denied IQ tests because they were bourgeois. Why do you deny IQ tests, Vaush?
I mean, when we talk about genes, there's like 15% difference between the races depending on how you define
15% of our DNA?
15%, not of our base pairs of our genes. Base pairs were 99% similar, but with genes between races, depending on how many races you choose,
Controlled for environment?
50%. What do you mean controlled for environment?
Like I said, the sickle cell shit in West Africa. Environment seems to cause a change in ones.
Depending on how many groups you break the human genetic continuum into.
No, controlling for
3 or
environment.
4.
My contention is that basically everything going on genetically, everything going on under the surface.
Okay, so Vaush doesn't understand either what an epigenetic effect is or what an allele is. You hear the caller going on this, what do you mean control for environment? And he's right. So first, your DNA looks like this, and each base pair on one side can be an A, C, T, or G, and you have the RNA polymerase that hooks onto the DNA, and it transcribes it into messenger RNA. The messenger RNA is then grabbed by a ribosome, which converts the RNA into proteins. Now, an epigenetic effect is when a methyl group is added to a base pair. Base pairs, the ACTGs on the DNA strand. This deactivates that base pair, and so when the RNA is going through the ribosome, that protein either doesn't get coded at all, or it's otherwise modified what gets coded. Another form of epigenetic effect involves the methylation of the histones, the things that the DNA wraps around, and this will modify the position of the DNA, and that somehow changes the order and frequency in which proteins are transcribed. I'm not so sure about what exactly histone rotations do. But Vaush, like the Lysenkoists and like the ancient Romans, believes that epigenetic effects can be passed on intergenerationally. The problem is that methylation is removed in the germline, i.e., all the methylation is reset in your sperm and eggs each generation as far as we know. Now, there was some research done on mice, and what the researchers found was that there was one group of mice with a bright yellow coat and another with a brown coat. The yellow coat, they know, is a result of methylating a down-regulating SNP, which causes a certain protein to be produced at a higher rate, which made their fur bright yellow. They then found that this effect was passed on intergenerationally between the mice. So it looked like the intergenerational transfer of epigenetic effects, or intergenerational transfer of methylation, which would be a mechanism for the heredity of acquired characteristics. The problem they found was that the methylation, they later found that the methylation on that site, which caused the mice's coats to turn yellow, that was a function of a SNP somewhere else on the DNA, which a certain variant caused the methylation of the downregulator, which is to say the methylation itself was caused by genetics, not environment. Because what base pairs on your DNA get methylated, or predisposition or sensitivity to environmental factors that can increase or decrease methylation of certain segments of your DNA, that is itself a function of your DNA. Now, all this epigenetics hubbubaloo, this is an object lesson in how much, buzz can be made out of something so small. And in fact, very few even know the source of this neo-Lysenkoist mania. But basically, we know epigenetic effects are reset in the germline, and if you want to say otherwise, well, the burden is on you to show it. Moreover, in humans, there's no pressing need for intergenerational epigenetic effects in order to explain anything. We can explain everything we see just fine with reference to DNA itself and the environment experienced in your lifetime. And remember, most theories in science that go against an orthodoxy tend to be wrong. What you read about in the history of the progression of science are those ideas that won out, not the losers. And I think big epigenetic effects and the intergenerational inheritance of acquired characteristics, this is going to go down in the books again as one of the losers. The reason it had so much buzz and had so much political push, despite being based on very little, was just because it fed into sort of third worldist racial oppression and racial revenge narratives. Now, here's where Vaush gets really dumb. Vaush doesn't understand that epigenetic effects have nothing to do with an allele frequency analysis. See, here's how this works. On your DNA, you have around 23,000 genes. You have somewhere around 5 million single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, or SNPs, and the DNA itself is made up of around 3 billion base pairs. Now, humans all have the same genes, and within each gene, the same SNP locations and start and stop codons all at the same locations. So in that sense, there is a great deal of uniformity common to all human DNA. However, within each gene, you have a bunch of SNPs, and there are only so many variants of a SNP that a human can have at any given location. So when comparing races or any other groups you want to compare, you could just take Mormons from Provo and Catholics from South Bend, and you could do an analysis between those two groups. What you're doing is you're looking at all the SNPs, and then you're looking for overlap and divergence. For example, say black people have allele A 60% of the time and allele B 40% of the time. And white people have allele A 40% of the time and allele B 60% of the time. That's 80% overlap, 20% discordant, and so blacks and whites are 20% or 0.2 different at that SNP. Now, overall, the between race differences all together, all told, run from 0.11 to 0.16 on this. Of course, you can say that this shows far more genetic variation common to humanity than variation that is racialized, and that's certainly true. However, this doesn't mean that there aren't close to typological differences between the races at certain points. Because the way variation actually works is that the races are the same and have almost no difference at most of the genome. And there's a small number of SNPs that show extreme raciation. And so you end up with some typological race differences even if we're mostly the same. In fact, way back, there was an analysis done, Wu and Zhang. They did an analysis and found that SNPs associated with variation in neuron and nervous system development showed more raciation or population differentiation than there was generally, including skin pigmentation. And what you'll notice is that neither this measure of genetic diversity and no other measure that I know of takes into account genetic methylation. And so while it took a while to explain this, hopefully now the viewer can see that when Vaush goes, did you control for environment when calculating allele frequency variation? This reveals a profound ignorance of both gene methylation and what an allele frequency difference is. Basically, Vaush doesn't know what either of these things are. He doesn't understand the basics of what it is he's talking about. Now, for me, I'm just a guy who took a few genetics classes in college and a guy who reads about as much as I think I need to read to talk about race differences. And I try to talk about this stuff as little as possible because I feel that molecular genetics is where I am most likely to make an error. I consider myself good as a statistical analyst. I'm not a biologist or a population geneticist. I simply try to know all that I need to know in order to do statistical analyses. Now, the man who knows nothing would never ask such stupid questions as what Vaush is asking. And a general pattern is Vaush is that he knows less than the man who knows nothing, because the man who knows nothing is at zero everywhere. He gets nothing right, he gets nothing wrong, while Vaush has anti-knowledge. And not only a great sum of anti-knowledge, but he has a system of anti-facts that reinforce each other. And so whenever you deal with him and deal with an anti-fact that he has, he then calls in other anti-facts that reinforce the other anti-facts. So you have to deal with what Vaush is saying sort of comprehensively. It's sort of an all or nothing, because otherwise he'll just fall back to some other anti-fact and continue to hold his beliefs.
Over 1,000 years of successful Roman civilization, and their conception of race was very different to ours. They didn't have black or white people or brown people or whatever. They didn't have swarthy people. They didn't have dark-skinned or light-skinned people. Well, of course they had those people, but they didn't care. The only thing they cared about was whether you were a Roman citizen or a barbarian. But within the purview of Roman citizens, black-skinned and white-skinned people, Moors from northern Africa, and Grecian people who would be considered white nowadays, they interacted just fine, with very little historical records of tension going along those lines. To them, skin color and race, what we would call race today, was just like eye color. to us. It's just like a physical thing that some people have and other people don't. And whatever, it doesn't mean anything.
I mean, it sounds like a plausible story, but I'm not convinced of that. I mean, the etymology of race goes back, probably to Tacitus.
Not our understanding of race. Our understanding of race is pretty concretely a product of the transatlantic slave trade.
You see, that's the story, but I'm really not. I'm really not sure of that.
I know, but I know it is. That's historical consensus.
Now, on this particular topic, there's actually a bit to go into. You hear what the caller said. That's a plausible story, but I'm skeptical. And the caller doesn't appear to know anything about this actual topic, but his instincts are sound. Vaush just claims and claims and claims another mythical historical consensus, as if such a thing exists or even means anything, or if historical consensus is going to be the same in the US as it is in China or the former USSR. It's just another one of these nonsense terms, really. What's annoying about this statement is that there's like a very thin amount of truth to what Vaush is saying, perhaps. There certainly seems like there was less racial conflict in the classical world, which, depending on definition, goes from around 800 BC to around 650 AD. But it's something very difficult to tell because what people tended to write about were big, important dates and events, not whether more European or Mediterranean peoples got along with the more Arabic-looking peoples on an interpersonal level day to day, to the extent such people interacted at all, and to the extent those interactions weren't thin slices. And by that I mean, for example, if you were in, say, modern-day Tuscany, your interaction with anyone from Egypt or Persia wouldn't be necessarily with the typical Egyptian or Persian. It would be with a merchant or someone in government or some military guy, not a representative of all the people from that area. In all likelihood, an elite thin slice of those people. And this is even true today, where you see white people in parts of the United States where they have less contact with blacks, such as in the Northeast, such as in like Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, or even Wisconsin to a lesser extent. They tend to have more positive views of blacks than whites from the southeastern United States. If you live in New England, for example, your perception of blacks will be from media, the few black guys you know who manage to buy a house in your neighborhood, a thin elite slice. They're not interacting with the great masses of black people across the entire spectrum in the way whites in Mississippi are, in the way whites in Alabama are, and in the way whites in South Africa are. And so the view of whites who live in, say, Denmark, or the view of whites who live in, say, a lily white enclave of Massachusetts, for example, their views of blacks are going to be a function of a prejudgment, of prejudice, whereas whites in the southeastern US or in South Africa, they have post-Judaist views that come from high volume interaction with a representative spectrum of black people. And for these same reasons, we probably shouldn't really care what ancient peoples thought about race, because their contact would be on thin slices, simply, and also because they had very little contact with other races, period. But we can look at what some thinkers thought about this. And this is from Aristotle's book, Politics, Book 7. He says, quote, "The peoples of cold countries generally, and particularly those of Europe, are full of spirit, but deficient in skill and intelligence. And this is why they continue to remain comparatively free, but attain no political development and show no capacity for governing others. The people of Asia are endowed with skill and intelligence, but are deficient in spirit. And this is why they continue to be peoples of subjects and slaves. The Greek stock, intermediate in geographical position, unites the qualities of both sets of peoples. It possesses both spirit and intelligence. The one quality makes it continue free. The other enables it to attain the highest political development and to show a capacity for governing every other people. Only it could once achieve political unity." And this is also from Hippocrates, Airs, Waters, and Places. And this is kind of interesting because it points to the fact that Lysenkoism or epigenetic determinism that Vaush is bandying about, this is not a new idea. This idea goes back at least as far as 400 BC. And here's the quote, and probably well before that. And here's a quote from Hippocrates from chapter 14 of Airs, Waters, and Places. Quote, "Thus, originally custom achieved the effect of elongated heads in the region of trapezus, that through force such a form developed. But as time went on, this happened naturally so that custom no longer forced it. For the seed comes from everywhere in the body, healthy seed from the healthy parts and unhealthy seed from the unhealthy parts. If bald children usually have bald parents, gray-eyed children usually gray-eyed parents, and squint-eyed children usually squint-eyed parents, and if the same is true for other physical characteristics, what prevents a long-headed parent from having a long-headed child? Now, however, it is not like in the past, for the custom is no longer in force because of intermarriage with other peoples." And also from the same book by Hippocrates, quote, "Those who live in a region which is mountainous, rough, high, and well-watered, where the changes of the seasons show marked differences, are likely to be tall, well-suited for endurance and courage, and such natures are likely to possess quite a lot of wildness and ferocity. Those who inhabit low-lying regions that are grassy, marshy, and have more hot than cool winds, and where there is hot water, those will neither be tall nor well-shaped, but tend to be stocky, fleshy, and dark-haired. They themselves are dark rather than blonde, more susceptible to phlegm than to bile. Similarly, courage and endurance are not by nature part of their character, but the imposition of law may produce them artificially." And this is from a book entitled The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity by Benjamin Isaac. His thesis is retarded. He's trying to say, he points, it's interesting, he points to all this racial thinking in classical antiquity and say it was invented by them, but we can talk about that at some other time. But he actually has a lot of interesting descriptions of the time, even if his ultimate thesis is kind of absurd. He says, quote, "This text, Problemata by Aristotle, further elaborates on the favorable effect of body and mind of the quote-unquote best mixture of qualities and the harmful effects of extreme climates referring to the cold of the northern Europe and the excessive heat of the Middle East and even into Africa. As examples of the physical effect of extreme heat, for instance, the text gives the bandy legs and curly hair of the Ethiopians and Egyptians. This is explained by analogy. Just as planks are warped when they dry, so are the bodies of living beings. It adds that those who live in the south have dark eyes, while northern peoples have gray eyes, and this is explained by the influence of the temperature and the balance of moisture in the body. In a similar manner, Airs, Waters, Places explains various collective physical features caused by climate, but unlike the Problemata, it also explains collective character traits. Here, too, the inhabitants of warm regions are cowardly, those in the cold regions courageous. The explanation given is that people who live in the cold are naturally hot and therefore brave, while those who live in the heat are naturally chilled and thus cowardly. The interdependence of body and soul, linkage between physical and mental processes, and relationship between personal character and external appearance were common assumptions among Greek thinkers. Aristotle adds a contrast not found in Airs. Europeans are incompetent and stupid, while Asiatics are intelligent and skillful. Aristotle has no doubts as to the relationship between climate and people. He agrees with the bipolarity of Europe representing a cold climate and Asia representing warmth. The cold climate produces free people with spirit who are, however, stupid and incompetent, a quality which extends to their political organization. The Asiatic climate produces soft people, intelligent and competent, but slaves. This is what Benjamin Isaac refers to as heredity of acquired characteristics when talking about classical antiquity, a continuum from Northern Europe down to Ethiopia. He says, quote, "In summary, the heredity of acquired characteristics is a concept generally accepted in Greece and Rome and explicitly formulated by several authors. It is found in several Hippocratic treatises, Aristotle, Strabo, Pliny, and others, and implicitly in many more authors." He also points out that this view was later shared by the natural philosopher and historian Polybius and Posidonius. From Book 6 of Vitruvius's work, Architecture, quote, "This is also the reason why the races that are bred in the north are of vast height and have fair complexions, straight red hair, gray eyes, and a great deal of blood, owing to the abundance of moisture and the coolness of the atmosphere. On the contrary, those that are nearest to the southern half of the axis," referring to the equator around the Earth, "and that lie directly under the sun's course, are of lower stature, with a swarthy complexion, hair curling, black eyes, but little blood on account of the force of the sun. Hence, too, this poverty of blood makes them over timid to stand up against the sword, but great heat and fevers they can endure without timidity, because their frames are bred up in the raging heat. Hence, men that are born in the north are rendered over timid and weak by fever, but their wealth of blood enables them to stand up against the sword without timidity. The pitch of their voice is likewise different. Further, it is owing to the rarity of the atmosphere that the southern nations, with their keen intelligence due to the heat, are very free and swift in the devising of schemes, while northern nations, being enveloped in a dense atmosphere and chilled by moisture from the obstructing air, have but a sluggish intelligence. The truly perfect territory, situated under the middle of the heaven, and having in each side the entire extent of the world and its countries, is that which is occupied by the Roman people. In fact, the races of Italy are the most perfectly constituted in both respects, in bodily form and in mental activity, to correspond to their valor. Hence, it was the divine intelligence that set the city of the Roman people in a peerless, temperate country, in order that it might acquire the right to command the whole world." Close quote. So the broad strokes of this is that the Romans were the best because of their geography, and the geography over generations changed the physical and mental traits of the people who lived there, and these changes were passed from parent to child, i.e. the hereditary transmission of environmental adaptation. And of course, this is a response to Vaush, and what I've done here is enough to say Vaush is wrong and dumb, but I'm going to do something here that may not be very smart, but I'm going to continue to talk about some interesting stuff that doesn't have to do with Vaush's rather turgid, one-dimensional view of these things. Because the ancient Roman writers had very different stereotypes of their neighbors than the later Europeans did 1500 onward. The later Europeans did not consider Middle Eastern peoples intelligent, and far less any subgroup of black Africans. More strange is the uniform conception that Northern Europeans were particularly violent. And on this, I will say that I do not think this is a function of thin sliced contact. I think that their stereotype back then was in fact true. And I talk about this in my video, The European Revolution. Feel free to pause this video right now, open the description, click on the video, The European Revolution, as you can understand where I'm coming from. It is, in my opinion, my best video. It is the most revolutionary video I think I have. If there's one video I would want you to watch, that would be it. And in it, I talk about how homicide rates in Northern Europe used to be crazy high. Crazy high. For England, about 15 times higher than they were in 1800. In Scandinavia, about 46 times higher than they were in 1800. In Germany, about 11.56 higher than they were in 1800. And in Holland and Belgium, about 31 times higher than they were 31 times higher in 1800 than they were in the 1200s. This collapse in the homicide rate in Northern Europe came as a result of executing petty criminals and the higher fertility rates of the wealthy replacing the lower classes. By contrast, blacks in the US today are only about 8 times more likely to commit homicide than non-Hispanic whites are. Northern Europeans were crazy violent, probably about 2 or 3 times as violent as US blacks are. And they became less violent over time due to a radical genetic change from 1100 AD to 1800 AD. And so when Romans perceived the barbarians as being barbarous, I don't think this was a false stereotype. And the mechanism that I proposed in the video, The European Revolution, is twofold. One was that about 1% of the male population was executed for some sort of crime each generation. and you do the math over multiple generations, that's going to have a substantial effect. And in fact, it's going to have a bigger effect than just chopping off, say, 30% of the criminals in a single generation, right? Because you retumble it over time, and I explain how that works. And another effect was that the upper classes replaced the lower classes genetically, and that this replacement of the upper class, of the lower class by the upper class, occurred more than 2 times. Now, on the matter of intelligence, there's an interesting paper coming out by Michael Woodley. It's not out yet. And this builds on a previous paper he did looking at the genome of ancient peoples. Now, Vaush just sort of proclaims Woodley to be a Nazi because Rational Wiki tells him to think that. So he's just going to hand wave this away. So for those people who sort of outsource their thinking to stuff like this, go ahead and go away. But for those who are interested in some research, Woodley is building on the previous research that he did looking at 66 ancient genomes. Now he's looking at over 2,000 ancient genomes. And now we can start to get some crude estimates of the quote-unquote genetic intelligence of people in the past. Now, this is definitely through a glass darkly, as even though we know through genome-wide association studies that IQ scores are at least 50% heritable, that's lower bound estimate, that's what they're able to find, so that's a minimum, that's sort of the floor. But these methods, genome-wide association studies, they don't tell us much about what genes do what. They just sort of tell you, in this region, here be heredity. It's sort of like here be dragons, kind of, right? But they don't tell you specifically where the dragon is. They sort of say, in this broad region is heredity. That's what a genome-wide association study does. And moreover, we're assuming that a person's profile for intelligence on the genes we do know about will, on aggregate, match the profile on the intelligence genes we don't know about, because we're assuming that they are a result of selection, which they are. Genes more associated with variance in IQ show more signs of selection than the rest of the genome. It's not an artifact of drift. But still, even though that's the case, there's still a bit of a leap from there to assume that the selective forces that caused the change in the polygenic scores on those genes also apply to the genes that we are sort of inferring the effects from. So, with all those caveats, all right, buyer beware on this, we can begin to get some sort of early, starting points on this stuff for the median genetic IQ for Middle Eastern peoples around 200 AD being around 91. For people of Latium, or Italy, around 94, and for people in France at the time around 90. Now, this is, of course, evidence of what I also suspected, in that the European Revolution radically increased the intelligence of Europeans, and it didn't just make them less violent. I.e., Northern Europeans went from being some of the most barbarous people in the world to being some of the most civilized. And I don't mean some ephemeral environmental effect. I mean a Darwinian genetic change. And as it stands, this theory has more evidence than historical theories that just ignore any possibility of genetic change. Right? You could say, well, this is a revision of environment-only theories of history. It's like, well, revision of what? The prior ideas were never so established that I think this even constitutes a revision so much as a first crack at truly understanding what happened, why Europe became so exceptional. And this gap between Rome and the barbarians to the north, this was something that lasted for over 1,000 years while Rome existed. And the stereotypes about the barbarians, they held for all of this time. And the relative backwardness of Northern Europeans relative to Rome held all of this time. This could not have been merely thin sliced contact, right? Over thousands of years. Over thousands of years, these disparities remained. There was, over thousands of years, you're going to get something akin to mass contact. These stereotypes of the Northern Europeans, they could not have been thin sliced. These were, in all likelihood, a reflection of how they actually were. And it wasn't up until after the mass executions spread throughout Northern European, and when the upper classes started to genetically replace the lower classes, that the homicide rates in Northern Europe fell, and at this time, coincidentally, Northern Europe began to catch up with and eventually surpass Spain and Italy in all the metrics of civilization. And there's so much more evidence for a genetic-driven explanation of the European explosion, especially the Northern European explosion, than there is for some thin, ad hoc, environment-only explanation, or some explanation that sort of tracks, that says, oh, the Renaissance did. Okay, well, the Renaissance, that's just another way of saying it happened, right? Saying the words the Renaissance is not an explanation, right? I mean, that's just a term, that's just a new word to describe what happened. And so there's all sorts of interesting stuff that's actually going on that can actually be investigated, and there's a whole new world of history to look at that includes genetics, that includes genetic differences between populations and genetic changes of populations over time. But instead, Vaush wants to not only deny any genetic anything, but wants to deny that classical Mediterranean peoples had any conception of race differences. And well, on that, again, that turgid point, all the people who wrote about it said no. There was nobody who wrote about race at the time who said, oh, everyone's the same. All the differences, they're all purely superficial. Nobody thought that. So, like, Vaush is wrong and dumb, and whoever is feeding him this information, whoever is feeding him this the narratives he's putting out here, this is, again, your sources are failing you, Vaush. That whoever's telling you this is failing you. They're wrong, and they're wrong in a very simple way. But what a bizarrely flat way to look at the world, you know? To imagine that humans don't change their mental characteristics in response to variation in the environments they are evolving in. How do you do that? Like, how do you believe in evolution, but then I guess just imagine the brain is off limits to evolution? Now, I've talked about this stuff for years, and this still puzzles me. I still cannot grasp how a person with a functioning brain could first believe in Darwinian evolution, but then think racial equality in anything is even possible, let alone an organ as complex and subject to the effects of virtually the entire genome in the way the brain is. It's just crazy. And the only thing I've been able to come up with is that they're simply not thinking in the way that you and I think, right? Thinking, quote unquote, to them means quoting authority and consensus. And in Vaush's case, a mythical consensus. And it's just a matter of relaying what is said by whoever they think the authorities are at their place and at their time in history. But like when you're doing it, like this seems to be a very obvious problem. Don't they see that what the relevant authorities in their place and time in history, that's just going to be a function of historical forces? Like if you're in China in the 1950s, the authorities are going to be very different, and they're going to say who the hell knows what. If you operate this way, if you operate with this highly authoritarian view of knowledge in the way Vaush does, what if there's corruption in these authority institutions down to the root? What if there is an across-the-board failure of the entire authority structure? What would you do then? Like, what if population geneticists at the 10 most elite universities just deny tenure or deny entrance into master's degree programs to anyone who doesn't publicly deny biological races? Just as a hypothetical, what if this was the case? And then those people said that biological race constituted a pseudoscientific view, and we won't credential anyone who holds this view regardless of their test scores. And then they do this, and then Vaush comes on and says, well, look, all the population geneticists at the top universities who publish in all the big journals, they all say that black people don't exist and that you should cut off your penis. Now, as I pointed out previously, as it happens, the consensus Vaush believes exists is mythical, but what if it wasn't? And what if the scenario I hypothesized actually was what was happening? If that was the case, then there would be no way to argue against it by Vaush's standards. You couldn't cite anything because all the journals would ban anything in favor of divergent evolution in humans. So there would be no real studies you could cite, and of course the research would be nothing but the environmental research that goes on. It would just be a bunch of correlational crap showing how, you know, having a nicer car is associated with a higher IQ. So we should just give poor people Ferraris and their IQs will shoot up 10 points. All their arguments are some variation on that. Now, it's a bit more sophisticated. They'll say something like good schools, access to a public pool. Wow, all these things associated with higher IQs. It's actually that stupid, and this is another thing. It's like people aren't going to believe me when I say that because, like, that's too stupid. How could these people actually be this stupid? And it's like, you just have, like, that's just something you learn from experience. They do this. We're constantly being assaulted with this phrase, did you know correlation is not causation? Like, when we're the only ones trying to tease out causation or close to it. And like these people, they'll publish 10,000 correlation-based environmental claims, make it look like there's some big, impressive body of knowledge and work, when really all these papers, they're all making the same fallacies, but nobody's rejecting them because they have no incentive to reject them. And tenure is predicated on how many articles you publish, so they just keep doing it. And they can't publish anything heterodox or they'll end up like Bruce Lawn or Larry Summers. Anyway, the subject of authorities and people like Vaush with the highly authoritarian view of knowledge, that's a whole topic in and of itself. And I think that's something that actually has to be done before you can really have a discussion about anything. Because if you have someone with an authoritarian view of knowledge, basically, he's outsourced his thinking to someone else, and you're not really talking with a person. You're just, he's going to cite the authorities, you know, he's got the answer, he's going to slap you down with what he claims authority says, and it's not really a conversation. It's just him saying the thing and trying to get, he's just relaying the authority, and he's not really listening to anything you're saying. So in order to have a conversation, in order to even open any kind of dialogue or any kind of thought, you have to break down faith in these authorities. Okay, if you, for example, if you had someone who was in the Soviet Union pushing, you know, Soviet genetics in like the 1960s, pushing Lysenkoism, the first thing you would have to do is break down the infallibility of the authorities. But this authoritarian view of knowledge, this is the only way I know to explain how someone can believe in evolution, but also believe in radical equality in latent cognitive abilities. But on the matter of classical people's not thinking racially, that's very, very false. Certainly their scope was limited and their ideas were false, but they did in fact think along racial lines. This is universal. This is not conditioned. This is not constructed. This is something immediately apparent to all thinking humans. When Japanese came into contact with Europeans, they conceived of European-Japanese differences the same way Europeans and Japanese conceive of them today, more or less. And it doesn't trace back to some evil movement, and it's not some propaganda campaign that got people to start thinking this way. And the ancient people weren't colorblind ethnicists, okay? Not only were the Romans racialists in that they thought about and categorized race, albeit badly, but they were racial supremacists in the way that would make modern white nationalists blush. Right? I mean, they basically say straight out, it's like, yeah, we Romans, we are the best race. Now, by dint of our environment, which influences our heredity, we are the best race, and we ought to rule the world. I mean, that's like, if that's not supremacism, if that's not racialized supremacism, like, I don't know what else could possibly be racial supremacism. They very much thought they were the best, and they had a pseudoscientific reasoning for why they were the best, and they genuinely were pseudoscientific. Pseudoscientific in that they didn't have experiments, natural or otherwise, to test their ideas. They didn't do any kind of factor analysis. And the closest analog to modern ideas that they had would be epigenetic determinists or Lysenkoists, and ironically, very similar to Vaush's thinking. Like, for example, Vaush thinking, you know, sickle cell is not genetic, but is an epigenetic effect that is impacted by the environment. That's sort of how Romans thought about, like, everything. That's funny. Vaush uses epigenetic effects to explain intergenerational racial differences that appear to be genetic. And, of course, they appear that way because they are. But the thing is, I'm old enough, and this is not a point of pride, but I've been around long enough to remember the biblical creationists trying to falsify biological evolution in all species using epigenetics. For example, they would say that an apparent change in a bacteria that evolved to digest synthetic fibers, that was actually just an epigenetic effect. And we see the same denial of real Darwinian genetic evolution in people like Vaush with regards to race. But at the end of all this, who the hell cares what the Romans and Greeks thought? The Romans were really fucking stupid. The Greeks were really fucking stupid. All this filleting of ancient Greece and Rome, it's just, I mean, that is a sign of someone who's a real dum-dum, if you like think that the Greeks and Romans have some amazing things to offer. But it's also kind of like black supremacists who try to say the Egyptians were black. They weren't, but why would you want to claim that? I mean, the Egyptian civilization on the whole is a stagnant embarrassment. Rome only slightly less so, and the pyramids are a monument to stupidity. Both Egypt and to a lesser extent Rome, their histories are of extreme poverty and stagnation. These were very poor people, and they would lose technologies over time. They were very stupid. They made very few advances in science. They fought constant wars. They lived very short lives. And increasingly, and we're going to know more and more going future, but their genotypic IQ score was very much lower than that of Europeans today. Stop filleting these people and stop caring what they thought.
Not our understanding of race. Our understanding of race is pretty concretely a product of the transatlantic slave trade.
You see, that's the story, but I'm really not. I'm really not sure of that.
I know, but I know it is. That's historical consensus. Our conceptualization of race, and people used to think that like French people were too swarthy to be considered white. People had some weird.
Huh? That's not what I know. The specific source that you're citing there, and that's Ben Franklin, and he didn't literally mean that.
Not Ben Franklin. No. There were historical texts from. I've read ones that detailed the 1400s. I am sure there are ones that can be corroborated across a broader length of time. People didn't really care about ethnic differences amidst like the European wars. They cared about religious differences, cultural differences, and like national heritage. They didn't call it national, like kingdom heritage. That was their like shit. But our modern conceptualization of white people being this like collective unified identity that stands opposite to the big other groups, which is black and brown and Asian people, that is very much a product of the 1600s and onward. There are no historical studies that indicate that worldview, that framework, being before that point.
Now, I haven't heard this one. I've heard Italians weren't white, I've heard Irish weren't white, I've heard Spaniards weren't white, but this is the first time I've ever heard someone say French weren't considered white. Now, typically, the way we deal with one of these race myths is by going back to some of the earliest writers on race, which of course started in the 1600s. The earliest I've been able to find was by Robert Boyle in 1664, and he clearly differentiated Europeans from everyone else. He talked about variation between Europeans, sure, and he spoke of the gradient change in complexion and attitude as one traveled from Scotland to South England to North France to South France to Spain, Portugal, and he talked about Amerindian peoples and people from the Indian subcontinent, Middle Eastern people, North Africans, and of course, Negroes. And in his writings by 1664, the categories are pretty close to what they are today. Now, there's probably a few things here and there that got wrong, but so what? Boyle is as far back as I know to go, and nobody after Boyle said that French people weren't white. Friedrich Blumenbach's races are pretty close to a modern conception, and by the time you get to Huxley in 1870, we're basically at the modern/correct answer on race. In the United States, in 1790, we know the government then at the time considered French, along with Italians, Irish, Spaniards, and Portuguese as white, as they accepted these people as immigrants when their immigration policy was restricted to quote-unquote free white men of good character. There's just kind of an absurdity, the idea that French weren't considered white So this mystery writer who said that French people weren't white or weren't European, he'd have to be before 1664, but after 23 BC. So, okay, there's a 1600-year window when someone could have said this, because that's the last Roman writings I know of on race. And of course, Gaul, modern-day France, was always considered a barbarian kingdom, part of Northern Europe. So certainly up to the end of the Roman Empire, the French had to have been considered white. So now we're compressing it to somewhere around 300 AD, sort of towards when the Roman Empire was kind of falling apart, though when the Roman Empire quote-unquote ended is subjective. But apparently there was a period during the Middle Ages where somebody or some majority of people somewhere thought French weren't European, because when we say white, we mean European, especially Northern European. But even if Vaush found this person who said that, so what? If he's trying to say that notions of race are fluid and it's this nebulous thing with profound disagreement, like, kinda, not really. Like, in the past, that was more true when people had more incomplete information. But the closer you get to today, the less that is the case. Now, today, you have the classic lumper versus splitter debates. How many categories? But these debates exist for all species, and with humans, it's just more emotionally charged. Like, there's debates as to how many divisions you want to divide up Africans, for example. But there's not a debate on, well, are Japanese people, are they closer to Kenyans or are they closer to Koreans? That's not a debate. There are lumper or splitter debates, but where you draw the lines is along a continuum that is universally recognized. Anyway, I'm just going to say here, Vaush is wrong about there having ever been a general belief in any significant region of the world that French people weren't European anywhere. Maybe he'll find one guy who said that, but I'm doubtful of even that. So Vaush is making stuff up, or maybe he heard something from a professor. Now, the thing is, professors, they're talking to like a bunch of kids. It's like they're making YouTube videos, but the YouTube videos, they get like, 40, 50 views. There's like 40 or 50 people watching their presentations. They're not getting a whole lot of criticisms. So they can just make up a bunch of bullshit, and there's nobody really there who is capable of questioning them. Moreover, the mental state of the people watching their videos, or live presentations in this case, they are predisposed to believe whatever the professor says. So you can think of a university classroom as a series of YouTube videos with very low views and with an audience that does not have any capacity to really challenge the video maker. And in taxonomy, there's constant debate about where one subspecies begins and where another ends. There's even debate as to what constitutes a species, how you would deal with a ring species, and humans are no different. The fact that you can draw the lines in multiple ways in no way invalidates the subspeciation of any species, be it Homo sapiens or any other mammal. So when looking at historical race writers, the only relevant question is how close did they get to the correct conception of race? And the answer is that the closer you get to the present year, the closer they got, but they were basically there by 1664. If you want to bring up Aristotle, for example, Aristotle was operating almost entirely within the Caucasian spectrum and didn't appreciate just how distinct black Africans were from Egyptians. He sort of saw Ethiopians as a continuation of a generalized humanity, with Ethiopians simply being an adaptation to extreme heat, going back to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. But when Europeans began contacting the other races, they began to form ideas of race very close to more modern views. Now, Vaush wants to harp on European racial views pre-1600, which is to say, European views on race prior to having contact with the entire world. I mean, and when you frame it that way, it's kind of a really stupid thing to think matters for anything. European views on race prior to having contact with the entire world. Now, he doesn't say who these people are or what they even thought, other than apparently some thought that French people weren't white and they really cared about their kings. I suspect neither of those things are true. He then says modern views on race are a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, they sort of coincided with the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade simply because they coincided with the beginnings of Europeans developing contact with the rest of the world. It's such a bizarre notion, and Vaush gives no evidence for this, and he doesn't explain at all our knowledge of race differences in East Asia and the Pacific, for example. What did that have to do with the transatlantic slave trade? But see, that's a tell that Vaush kind of got academic, and that's where all this nonsense is coming from. I think he sat in a classroom and someone told him that there's like a lot of research, just vaguely proclaiming there's a lot of research that the transatlantic slave trade is why we view Indians from the Indian subcontinent as distinct from Tibeto-Burmese, for example. Like here's another example. William Dampier in 1688, he traveled to New Guinea and made first contact with the Melanesians, the people who were aboriginal to Australia and New Guinea and some of the surrounding islands in the Pacific. And upon first contact, he noticed some similarities between them and Africans, but he was very well aware, by the time he wrote his first writings on this, he was very well aware that they were not Africans upon closer inspection of their appearance, and their behavior was very different from Africans, just like it is to this day. And since Vaush says that our ideas on race come from the transatlantic slave trade, how was William Dampier immediately, upon first contact in January of 1688 with the Melanesians, how does him knowing that they are not any kind of black African have anything to do with the transatlantic slave trade? This is nonsense. Again, what I think happened is he just got fed this, maybe from some guy in college, and like he was told this and he thinks it's some deep well and some well-established fact, when it's just errant verbiage from people who posted YouTube videos that got 40, 50 views, preaching to an audience of kids who are already predisposed to believe whatever the guy is saying. And also, just the way Vaush talks about things in general, he seems to imagine that the level of research on things and history, biology, psychology, any field, he seems to imagine that there's far more research done that establishes what is generally believed in a field than there actually is. And it's just the way he talks about things. For example, the question of how many hours a day black slaves worked in the United States, well, we can compare cotton output per day on a slave versus free farms, keeping in mind that free farms were less efficient and free farmers had to spend more hours per day on structural maintenance, whereas the plantations, they had division of labor and a degree of vertical integration, and so they were more efficient, basically. And we have experiments from a guy who decided to, for 1 year, plant and pick cotton the way it was done in the 1800s, and from this he came to a figure that black slaves worked between 10 and 12 hours a day and fewer hours a day than white people worked. And that's basically it. Now, a layman, or someone who doesn't have much experience actually reading studies, is going to be unaware of how normal this is, how normal it is to have a very few pieces of evidence that establishes a fact that is then used for everything else. How our knowledge on any specific topic is usually based on a small number of facts. People who have this retarded reverence for authorities, they just imagine that there's some ocean of research on every single little topic. And people who think this way, not just Vaush, but people who think this way are people who haven't actually read a lot of studies. Okay, they haven't actually dealt with real research at the level of actually reading journal articles. Because as you begin to read more and more journal articles, it's just something you pick up and know over time that research on stuff generally is far thinner than the person who doesn't read studies imagines. This is not, we don't have Star Trek science. And basically Vaush, he just has a ton of noob sign. He has a ridiculous conception of the nature of research and what actually goes on in the journals. He has a ridiculous conception of academic consensus. He doesn't know what academic consensus even is on any particular issue. But on this topic about, say, what some people in the past thought about race, like, who cares? Why should we care if Joachim Lickenpooper thought French people were chimpanzees? Good for him, good for them, no reason for us to care. And I also suspect, and this is something that not just Vaush does, but a lot of people who are desperate to deny race and they don't really care about the truth of the matter is something like they'll say, oh, look at this person in the past. He referred to the Scottish race or the Irish race. This clearly means white people don't exist. Now, they don't say it that bluntly. They don't put it in a nutshell like that, right? They keep the statements sort of apart, so they create this vague impression that race is this nebulous and constantly changing thing. Like, let's take Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, for example, in his speeches, in Mein Kampf and the Table Talks, he would refer to the Polish race, the French race, the Italian race, etc. But then in an address to his officers in 1942, he lamented how, by allying with Japan, he was aiding in the destructions of the empires of the white race, singular. And in a meeting with the French Prime Minister in 1938 on Czechoslovakia, he appealed to not let the situation escalate to war for the good of the white race, singular. A normal person, just a normal person with a functioning brain who's not heavily ideologized, can read all of this and tell that Hitler is using race in different senses in different times depending on what he's talking about. Now, would Vaush read these statements from Hitler and go, oh geez, I'm so confused. Over here, he's referring to the Polish and French race, but over here, he's referring to some singular white race. How crazy and hypocritical is this? It's retarded. Or better yet, pretending to be confused, and going, well, there are no differences in cognitive ability between any identifiable groups of people in the United States because in the 1300s, some poet referred to the Scots as a race. And this bringing up about what people in the past cared about, I guess he thinks that's some refutation of something. If anything, it just showed how narrow-minded people before 1500 were compared to the people in the 1800s. We knew more about the world, and there developed a class of people, especially those who were well-traveled or otherwise knowledgeable about the world outside of Europe and the Near East, and these people were more aware of how trivial within Europe differences were, and how many, many times more important the differences between Europe and the rest of the world were. Vaush is saying that the dum-dums in the Middle Ages didn't care about biological race, but they cared about more narrow-minded things. Yes, Vaush, the more narrow-minded people who knew less about the rest of the world, before 1500, they did think more narrowly. And once humans became more scientific-minded and had more contact with the rest of the world, they developed a more realistic view of race and of general human variation, more granular than that. And this is still true in Eastern Europe and China, as they didn't learn all the wrong lessons from the war with Nazi Germany. And I think I should reiterate this. Vaush correctly point out that as Europeans became more scientific-minded, they developed a more modern conception of race. In fact, people in his own sort of totalitarian third worldist camp, they have a snarl word for this called scientific racism. But even their smears and snarls, there is a sliver of truth. Scientific. What prompted the development of modern racial views was the ascendance of a more scientific, or at least empirical, way of thinking and actually having contact with people around the world. I mean, it should be a little bit concerning for someone like Vaush that when Europeans became more scientific and worldly, their views on race moved towards the kind of views that I have, whereas when they weren't scientific and had more limited contact with the rest of the world, they believed in the inheritance of acquired traits, more similar to what Vaush thinks than to what I think. Even though they were still racial supremacists in the clearest and most bellicose definition of the term, something Vaush would oppose and so would I, their actual descriptive beliefs about the nature of heredity were closer to Vaush than to mine. But this makes sense because you have people that don't have any real understanding of biology, and so they come to rather silly conclusions. And when sociologists try to do biology, they come to silly conclusions along similar lines. Retarded minds think alike, or profound minds think alike. When did the academic community in the West begin rejecting biological race? After World War II. It didn't flip right away, but that's when the trend started. How peculiar how peculiar that academics began their shift toward the denial of heredity and the denial of subspeciation after being fed false beliefs that these were associated with the Nazi regime. Gee, I wonder what great scientific advances in human biodiversity were made between the years 1939 and 1945 that could have propelled this seismic shift. I mean, there's a much clearer explanation for this. It is fear of Hitler, misunderstanding of the Nazi regime, and learning all the wrong lessons from the Nazi regime. But it's getting harder and harder to lie about this as we're cracking the genome more and more. Now, the conclusions from a 1998 conference on race entitled Race, Myth or Reality, they came to the following conclusions. 1. According to the old anthropological traditions, big human morphological variations, which are the result of polymorphism united by common origin in certain geographical areas, have been given the name races. 2. The reality of racial subdivisions of Homo sapiens are supported by the totality of the scientific data investigated on the different levels of human organism, morphological, physiological, and genetical. This is a translation from Russian, by the way. Racial classification created with regard for morphological criteria clearly enough reflect the phylogeny of the separate populations and groups of populations. 3. Negativism to the race concept, which became apparent during the last decades, in many respects might be explained by the psychological shock which all progressive humanity had felt in the epoch of Hitlerism. What is Vaush going to say when the genetic proportion of heredity between race, within race, and altogether is actually found down to the molecular genetic level, and it confirms divergent evolution, and the Chinese start moving beyond CRISPR and they start to have some real-world application based on this knowledge? Unfortunately, I think that's what it's going to take for someone like Vaush. It's going to take functional refutation. The presentation of evidence and the presentation of arguments will not persuade him. It is going to require the literal application of this knowledge in human genetic engineering and gene therapy and gene doping. I think that is the only kind of thing that would ever convince Vaush. And even then, he may find a way to deny it even at that point.
Yeah, my argument would be that this is largely because of systemic discrimination, and that agitation tends to crop up because we still have a lot of baggage to deal with when it comes to treating people equally. Not that there's like an intrinsic, like black people and white people are like magnets, like they have different diodes in their head, and if they come too close, they have to fight each other. I don't think this is the case. And to support my argument, I would cite a plethora of pre-modern civilizations, the easiest one being Rome, which has outlasted our civilization up to its point by quite a long time.
Now, I want to make it clear I am not criticizing the black pilots or ground crews. They were called to arms, they answered the call, and they fought as best they could, risked their lives, and many gave their lives to fight a terroristic, genocidal regime, the second or third most mass-murdering regime in history, and certainly in the top 10 for the most evil. Their courage and their service should be respected. They certainly fought harder and risked more for freedom than any of us have. So I want to make that clear before talking about this, that my criticism is against the institutions that created this fighter squadron, not against the men themselves. From the Tuskegee Airmen, the men who changed a nation, quote, in late 1943, it was observed that 79.3% of the black youth scores fell into the Stanine group, score group on the ASVAB, of 4 and 5, in contrast to 14.6% for white applicants falling in between 4 and 5. There was a demand for black pilots to serve as replacements for the fighter units in combat and for the organization of the 477th Bombardment Group, a planned, almost all black bomber group. To meet the demand for the black units, black youths were accepted for pilot and bombardier training with Stanine scores of not less than 4 and not less than 5 for navigator training. On the other hand, there were more qualified white applicants. a Stanine score of 6 or better was required for pilot and bombardier training, and not less than 7 for navigator training. The 332nd Fighter Wing, which was the almost all-black fighter wing, in Italy, they lost 1 bomber for every 11.48 missions. All other fighter wings, which included wings with P-38s, an aircraft that was demonstrably inferior in almost every regard, they only lost a bomber every 16.53 missions. White U.S. pilots in P-51s were achieving kill-death ratios 3.4 times better than that of the 332nd. The black group was the only fighter group with a kill-death ratio of less than 1. Keep in mind, especially as you get into 1944, the German Air Force training was roughly half the time for U.S. pilots and proportionately less of the time that was spent actually flying due to fuel shortages. So in terms of actual experience flying aircraft, the German pilots had roughly 1/4 the time actually in the aircraft before being thrown into combat. And they were being thrown into combat flying primarily Me-109s, an aircraft that was first put into production in the middle of 1936, 7 years earlier. And the Germans tried to mod the Me-109 as much as they could to make it somewhat competitive with more modern US fighters, but the performance was inferior in virtually every aspect. Another reason their performance was inferior was due to the lower octane fuel that the Germans were forced to use, since more than half of their fuel came from synthetic plants, which produces lower octane than natural crude. Also, from the pilot standpoint, all of the early aces, all of the early savants who were in the Air Force from the beginning, and all of the volunteers had all been killed off. By mid-1943, the German Air Force was drafting pilots, forcing people to be pilots, whereas the Western Air Force still had enough skilled people willing to fly to where they were an all-volunteer Air Force. This is why the white pilots achieved these kill-death ratios. They had superiority in every way you can think of, and this is who the black pilots were losing to. If the Allied Air Forces performed at the level of the 332nd, the Black Fighter Wing, they probably would have lost the air war. Even with the technological, training, and material advantages that the 332nd had, they were still losing to drafted, poorly trained Germans in poor aircraft with inferior fuel. Imagine if the 332nd, instead of going up against conscript pilots, were going up against real volunteers, who instead of having a third as much time in aircraft training as them, they had equivalent training time, and instead of having these 1936 airframes hot-rodded in a desperate attempt to keep them relevant, that they were actually going up against an opponent with equally capable aircraft and who weren't forced to use lower octane fuel. What would the KD ratio have been in a fair fight? It wouldn't have been 0.66, it would have been significantly worse than that. And no, it's not because they were so diligent about escorting bombers. Again, the 332nd lost a bomber every 11.48 missions compared to the other fighter wings losing a bomber every 16.53 missions. In all likelihood, in addition to being more likely to get shot down themselves, they were more likely to get whoever they were escorting killed. Eleanor and Theodore Roosevelt kept pushing for more and more black pilots because they were so progressive. But the Air Force, the guys who actually had to fight and win the war, they put the brakes on this experiment as much as they could. As a result, they ended up shuffling all of these fake black officers into Tuskegee. Tuskegee ended up being kind of a dumping ground for all of these black quote-unquote officers, and the result was overcrowding the base, and all the black people in the Tuskegee were all pissed that they weren't being put into combat. Or if there were blacks that would arrive into a theater, they'd be put into work in logistics. And this was true for the Air Force, but also true for the Army. The Army made a strategic decision to keep these blacks in logistics and not have them at the front. Now, was this racism on part of the Air Force doing this? They already had to lower standards roughly 1.5 standard deviations to get a single black fighter group. How much lower would they have had to drop the standards to get another black fighter group? This is the reality of the red tails. Black privilege shoehorning itself into the US military and undermining the war effort. If anything is treason, it's this. It's the people responsible for pushing and creating this racist disgrace.
Yeah, you mean like the Nigerians that immigrate here? They have an average higher IQ, vastly higher.
The best of the best. What my problem is with taking the best of the best is that those other countries aren't going to get better.
See, that's an interesting theory, unsubstantiated by data.
Okay, so there's a lot of noise around credentials and certification levels of various groups of people, and they don't bother to really clarify what these things mean, what these means in terms of actual ability, how they actually got these certificates. And that's why I brought up the story of the red tails before going into this. All these pilots, quote unquote, for the red tails, they had all the official qualifications to be fighter pilots. All of the official documentation said they were good to go, but they weren't. It was a fraud. Not intentionally on the part of them, I want to make that clear. The black fighter pilots themselves weren't intentionally trying to fool anyone, just as I don't think Nigerians are necessarily trying to fool anyone, though that would be more likely. But the admissions offices and the heads of these institutions are trying to push Africans far past their ability and merit. Since this is about IQ, we actually have IQ data on college graduates by race. Now, this is verbal IQ, which blacks do relatively better on compared to the rest of, so the racial gaps are going to be smaller than what you would find on a full-scale IQ test. A telling fact is that blacks with a graduate degree have verbal IQs around 102, whites with a high school diploma 98. Now, you might use this as an excuse to spiral off into IQ denial, which would be very stupid, as IQ is one of the most validated constructs not only in psychology but in science generally, i.e. it has some of the highest power, i.e. carrying the weight of prediction of stuff, of anything in science generally. That's why it's hanging around despite the politics of the universities, who are only going to be biased against it, just like your very cool professors were, Vaush. Well, if you don't like IQ, then fine, let's look at adult literacy scores. Sean and I made this table, and estimated IQ is just the conversion of adult literacy test scores to a normal bell curve distribution with the mean set to 100 by construction. It's just a way to easily visualize and compare the data by creating a adult literacy IQ score equivalent. And this is a government test, and I'll go ahead and read the descriptions for what kinds of questions they're asking. Prose literacy: the knowledge and skills needed to understand and use information from texts that include editorials, news stories, poems, and fiction. For example, finding a piece of information in a newspaper article, interpreting instructions from a warranty, inferring a theme from a poem, or contrasting views expressed in an editorial. Document literacy: the knowledge and skills required to locate and use information contained in materials that include job applications, payroll forms, transportation schedules, maps, tables, and graphs. For example, locating a particular intersection on a street map, using a bus schedule to choose the appropriate bus, or entering information on an application form. And quantitative literacy: the knowledge and skills required to apply arithmetic operations, either alone or sequentially, using numbers embedded in printed materials. For example, balancing a checkbook, figuring out a tip, completing an order form, or determining the amount of interest from a loan advertisement. So at the high school dropout level, whites are about 10 points higher, high school graduate whites 9 points higher, 2-year degree 10 points higher, 4-year degree 10 points higher, and graduate degree 11 points higher. Keep in mind the full-scale black-white IQ gap is about 15 points, and yes, it's still 15 points, and it's not narrowing. That's a myth, but that's a topic for another time. For an idea of what this means in terms of percentile gaps, because that's how most people think, this is about a 23.57% gap for high school graduates, 27.64% gap for those with graduate degrees. So in terms of percentile rank order, blacks with graduate degrees are about 27.64% lower than whites with graduate degrees. Also, this vindicates the claim that blacks are being shuffled through the system and being moved up the grades artificially and being passed when they shouldn't pass because schools are under political pressure to pass more blacks. Red tails. On top of being black, they are also foreign, these Nigerian immigrants are. And according to Mike Moyers, a black applicant from a foreign country is twice as likely to be accepted as a black person from the US, and that foreign-born applicants are privileged ahead of US-born applicants. So if you want to get into an elite university in the US, move to a foreign country, and claim to be black. For a given SAT score, blacks are already 14.26 times more likely to get into a top 20 university than an equivalent white applicant, so the Nigerian applicant multiplier is already around 28.5 if we just multiply that by 2. Also, keep in mind that for any given SAT scores, whites on average have better grades and a better resume in other aspects, as university applications departments have objective weighting for various classes of extracurriculars. Whites actually do better on that for a given SAT score. So by using SAT scores, we are, if anything, using a number that is biased in favor of blacks relative to the whole application. Now, blacks in the US are handed roughly 166 points on the SAT on the 1600 scale compared to whites. So these Nigerian immigrants, I don't know exactly how the distributions work, but they're probably spotted at least 200 points on the SAT. A degree is a certificate, and these are certificate games, and these universities can give degrees to whoever they want. They can accept whoever they want, they can pass whoever they want. And so they can create a racist alternate reality where their favored groups get more than the people they hate, whites. And keep in mind that at top 10% universities, you are better off not being in ROTC or 4-H, which are military and agricultural organizations, than you are being in them. Meaning that, straight up, you are better simply removing those things from your resume and replacing them with nothing than you are by having those things on your resume. Add to this the fact that legacies get a roughly 60% higher chance of getting in for a given SAT score and GPA. And if you're a rural white from the US, your chances of getting into an elite university are very, very small. And if you're pro-military or pro-ag, you basically have no chance no matter how good you are. It is a racially discriminatory system, and it is a culturally discriminatory system. And a great irony is that people like Vaush accuse the gatekeepers of the past of discriminating unfairly against blacks, something which there's very little evidence of. And in fact, there's evidence going the other way, even as far back as the 1910s. But they make that accusation in the past when that is precisely what they are doing now, and they are doing it now in a clear and unambiguous way. Now, several states, including California, have outlawed this, which they should, but universities do it anyway. Richard Sandler, a UCLA law professor, tried to figure this out because he noticed that there were a lot of very low ability black and Hispanic students at UCLA, supposedly an elite university, and he was wondering what the heck is going on. The admissions board would not give him the information, so he had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to see what UCLA was doing. UCLA, along with all the other University of California schools, ostensibly had a holistic score which took into account your parents' education level, income, the neighborhood you're in, the school you're in, and any other incidental factors. And what they found was that even with the same holistic score, which in my opinion is mostly bogus based on the results of twin adoption studies and voucher studies, they still radically discriminated against whites. They were engaging in pure racial discrimination. In response, the admissions board admitted that without this pure racial discrimination against whites, there would be basically no black people at UCLA. If it was purely a function of merit, there would be something like 11 blacks at UCLA. Go read my article on affirmative action. This is all very simply shown. The math is not complicated. It's first-year statistics stuff I'm doing. There are no tricks. But on top of all of this, if we're talking about Nigerian immigrants, we have to consider, did they get their degrees in Nigeria or in the US? Now, I don't have data specifically on Nigerian universities, but foreign universities in general produce worse results. These results, presented by Jason Richwine, showing literacy, numeracy, and computer operations scores for natives, immigrants with a US degree, and immigrants with a foreign degree. And in all three categories, natives, which combines all levels of schooling, did better than immigrants. And keep in mind, most people in the United States do not have a college degree. So this native category is primarily people without college degrees. But note that immigrants with US degrees fared much better than immigrants with foreign degrees. The closest immigrants got to native proficiency was immigrants with a U.S. degree on numeracy. And even that was lower than the mostly degreeless population of the United States. Now, the only black African country where I was able to find the data on IQ results for university students was in South Africa. And Richard Lynn's Race Differences in Intelligence points to 13 studies in South Africa, 8 of which compared scores of European students at the same university. And of course, it depends on which university you test, but in chronological order, we have a 19-point gap, 28-point gap, 21-point gap, 20-point gap, 23-point gap, 13-point gap, 14-point gap, 15-point gap. And for all of those you guys who really hate Philippe Rushton, you think Philippe Rushton is a hateful racist who's going to skew the data, Rushton actually gave the 3 smallest gaps of the 8 studies that had between race comparisons. Now, I think that's because Rushton chose the more elite universities in South Africa, to the extent... Yeah, elite university in South Africa, haha. But relatively speaking, he chose the more elite ones, so there was probably more compression in the samples that Rushton chose, because the white scores were also, in absolute terms, the highest in Rushton's samples. And just keep in mind, when Richwine is averaging the results from foreign universities, that includes Japanese universities, Russian universities, Canadian, British, and French universities, averaged in with South African universities, Mexican universities, Nigerian universities. This table here, presented by Richwine, the results of Nigerians from Nigerian universities are probably lower than this, because again, this is being averaged in with Chinese immigrants from Chinese universities, Japanese immigrants from Japanese universities, which, based on PISA and TIMSS international test scores, those universities are as good, if not better, than United States universities. Now, Vaush claims there is no evidence that there has been a brain drain from Nigeria. Now, there's actually a way to measure this, and it's binary skilled versus unskilled immigration. Of course, skilled immigration from Nigeria, quote unquote. But that classification is useful as it tells us what slice of Nigeria we're getting. And for Nigerian emigrants, people leaving Nigeria, there are 4.27 emigrants classified as skilled for every 1 unskilled emigrant. So 4.27 to 1, that's a hefty brain drain. But keep in mind, Nigeria isn't like 50% skilled and 50% unskilled. It's going to be mostly unskilled. In fact, Dakuyer and Rappaport quantify this by looking at skilled emigration rate versus unskilled emigration rate. And for Nigeria, again, quote unquote skilled, people are 108 times more likely to emigrate if they are skilled than if they are unskilled. So the Nigerians you meet in the US are about 108 times more likely to be in the top 4% of Nigerians than is the typical Nigeria who stays in Nigeria. Because that's about what it works out to, that about 4% of Nigerians are classified as skilled. And of all the migrants from Nigeria, 4.27 come from this top 4% for every one that comes from the bottom 96%. So yes, the brain drain on Nigeria is extreme. In fact, it is the 11th most brain drained country on the planet, behind only Chad, Lesotho, Malawi, Mongolia, Mozambique, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Rwanda, the Solomon Islands, and Uganda. Those are the only countries that suffer more brain drain than Nigeria. And here's a quote from Adebayo from 2010 describing the situation at Nigerian universities. Quote, "Brain drain has distorted the organizational structures of some Nigerian universities. In most cases, brain drain has placed the academic departments of the Nigerian universities in a state of chaos and no direction. Many departments of Nigerian universities have lost the middle cadre of their lecturers to brain drain, while most of their senior and junior lecturers were left behind. The senior lecturers will soon retire, and the junior lecturers who received little training are saddled with a lot of departmental responsibility, ranging from heavy teaching to department administration and university administration. In some cases, when the seniors leave, the departments become leaderless. In fact, many departments in the universities exist without a professor. Many Nigerian scholars who traveled for their doctorate degree abroad were employed by their host universities, and chances that they will come back to fill the vacuum they left in Nigeria is very minimal." Now, it's always interesting to listen to takes from Black Africans in Africa talking about just anything, because they're not thinking about what implications what they say has on like race debates in the United States. So at least this Nigerian academic will tell you that the brain drain has been crippling, and the quantitative analysis will tell you that brain drain is severe, because he doesn't know that that is evidence that the Nigerian immigrants to the US are in fact an elite thin slice. And if we assume equal distribution within ranges between skilled and unskilled immigrants from Nigeria, we would expect that Nigerian migrants to the US are, on average, at the 6.55 percentile mark for all Nigerians. They are far and away the elite of Nigeria, and this elite group is then given roughly 28 times the acceptance rate compared to similarly qualified whites. Converted to free SAT points, that's probably around 200 to 250 points. And I think I should add a little in before on this, because some of you will say, oh, but they graduate. Once they get here, they're able to go through the coursework and complete the curriculum. Well, okay, they graduate, but what do you think that means? Here's something that's interesting, and this is from the 2000 book, The Affirmative Action Hoax. It says, quote, the average score in prose literacy, 298, of blacks with a postgraduate degree, which is master's or doctorate, was lower than the level needed, 304, to read a news article and identify a sentence that provides an interpretation of a situation. The average score in document literacy, 285, of blacks with a postgraduate degree was much lower than the level needed, 314, to use a bus schedule to determine the appropriate bus for a given set of conditions. The average score in quantitative literacy, 285, for blacks with a postgraduate degree was much lower than the level needed, 308, to use a calculator to determine the discount from an oil bill if paid within 10 days. Now, this is from 2003, and since then the proportion of the population going to college has only expanded, so we can only expect that if adult literacy surveys were given today, that the scores would be lower. So if anything, what a degree represents is almost certainly less today than it was in 2003 for everyone, not just blacks and Hispanics, and so we should expect the abilities of current doctorate holders to be even less than even these dismal results. And there's a wide variety of ways in which this is allowed to happen and in ways in which this is hidden. For example, there are universities that no longer have letter grades at their medical schools. They have simple pass-fail systems. Moreover, a student is allowed to take the class as many times as he wants, and once he completes the class and once he passes, the pass grade is put on his permanent record and the fail grade is expunged from his permanent record. And so everyone who graduates Harvard Medical has the exact same grades. And this is done at least, these are the universities that I know of where this is done. This is done at least at Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Columbia, Drake, Stanford, George Washington University, Tulane, University of Virginia, Virginia Commonwealth, University of Cincinnati, Emory, Florida Atlantic, Wake Forest, University of Wisconsin, Oakland, Rosalind Franklin, Michigan State, St. Louis University, Hofstra, Tufts, University of Alabama at Birmingham, Wayne State, Western Michigan, Central Michigan, Vanderbilt, University of Southern California, Johns Hopkins, Boston University, Drexel, Roland Franklin, Rutgers, Tufts, UCLA, UC San Diego, UC San Francisco, and that is all that I know of. And in fact, in addition, I know of 4 universities, Tufts, Pitt, Texas Tech, and Rochester, that don't even require the MCAT anymore. For those that do, the acceptance rate differences by race are also very severe, and they are the most severe at the lowest end. For an MCAT score of 24 to 26 and a GPA of 3.2 to 3.39, blacks get into a medical school at a rate of 65.8%, whereas whites only get in 9.4% of the time. So to say, oh, well, once they're in, they still have to do the work in order to get postgraduate degrees, that's a half-truth. They don't have to do the work in the way you and I would have to do the work. They are privileged by the system every step of the way. And this data is just for blacks overall. Nigerians are foreign blacks, so their acceptance rate is probably going to be even higher than even this in all phases as they work through their university career. So you talk about these Nigerians having all these bachelor's and postgraduate degrees. Okay, well, maybe they can read a bus schedule. Maybe that's what it means. Probably not, given that most blacks with a post-secondary education can't, and as foreigners they're getting even more preferential treatment, but they might be more likely to be able to read a bus schedule or figure out the change for a tip. The Nigerian migrants are an extreme elite. They are favored for being black, and they are again favored for being foreign. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's a Nigerian scam. It is a red tail. Now, Vaush said IQ, and I have never seen any IQ data on Nigerians in the United States. And since I haven't seen this data, I know Vaush hasn't either. However, I addressed African immigrant IQ to the UK, and in the UK they never had slavery or segregation, so I will just clip that and play that here. The video was entitled "The UK Gaslight," and it deals with the myth of non-Europeans in the UK doing exceptionally well on standardized tests or doing exceptionally well in schooling. And yes, at the time, I unfortunately had the background image as the division insignia for a Hungarian SS division. I did not know what it was at the time. I used it because I saw some other user on Facebook use it, and I liked how it looked, so I used it not knowing what it was. That said, here's the section from that video dealing with, among other things, black immigrants to the UK from my video, The UK Gaslight. And all of this is what we would predict given the results of several IQ studies in the UK, which repeatedly and from different authors show a racial pattern similar to that of the United States. Of course, it always comes down to the sample. Are these representative samples? They try to be. Are they? Well, all these data points seem to fit. And these racial disparities also exist on the LNAT, or the UK equivalent of the LSAT, and on the BAR vocational course exam. You can see the racial averages with the LNAT, and with the BAR they don't give averages, but percents outstanding, very competent, and merely competent, and the remainder from this are the people who didn't pass. A similar racial stratification exists on the UK CAT, the UK equivalent of the MCAT, and it's about 1 standard deviation between whites and blacks on the UK CAT. And all this is interesting given that the LNAT, BAR, and UK CAT are supposed to be very elite, and so we shouldn't be seeing much in the way of race differences up here. This is because at the elite level, you're supposedly only getting the very best, period, regardless of race. But that's not what we see. We actually see the races attempting the UK CAT, LNAT, and BAR in rough proportion to their slice of the UK population. Perhaps a more representative test would be the averages for firefighter applicants in the UK. Unfortunately for this, we only have the categories white and non-white, so it's hard to make much of this without knowing who's in the non-white category. And we can also look at PISA scores, and we can compare the UK to the US on the PISA scores. Keep in mind that Asian in the US is equivalent to the UK categories of Indian and Chinese, and Arabs in the US are classified as white. In the UK, Indians, Arabs, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis are classified as Asian, while Chinese, Korean, and Japanese are classified as Chinese. And one thing we can see is that the gaps on the PISA tests are much smaller in England, which is this part of the UK, than they are in the US. But we also have data from Wales in 2012. Wales is this part of the UK. In addition to all the scores being lower than that of England, they show a racial gap similar to what we see in the US. So what's going on, England? Maybe a little bit of a Potemkin village going on here? Maybe not having your worst minority schools take the PISA so as to artificially narrow the racial gap on this? While Wales is more honest, so they show a gap similar to what exists in the US, as well as letting their worst students period take the test. That if you cut out the worst students taking the PISA test, not only will your scores be higher like they are in England, but if a disproportionate number of your worst students are black and Pakistani and Bangladeshi, the result is going to be to narrow the racial gaps as well. Okay, so this video is called The UK Gaslight, and the gaslight I'm talking about is people who use the GCSEs and more recently this little Cat 3 IQ test. So let's talk about that first. The Cat 3, or Cognitive Abilities Test 3, these results were first found by a white nationalist who is now a PhD in psychology. So obviously I can't give his name. And I remember seeing this table for the first time on the first blog post that this was actually found on by this guy. Now, the Cat 3 actually has a US equivalent called the COG AT7. And we can compare UK race gaps on the CAT3 to US race gaps on the COG AT7. They're the same test. And we can see that the black-white gap on that is about the same in the US as it is in the UK, and given the ocean of IQ and standardized test data showing a 15-point black-white IQ gap, we can use that touchstone to surmise that this test, probably by design, yields smaller race gaps than other tests do. So people who like to push the CAT3 results, they're making a big stink about nothing. They're bringing up 6-year-old white nationalist backwash that was shown to not matter. But the real gaslighting comes from the GCSE data, or General Certificate of Secondary Education data, which shows what you can see here. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the GCSEs, but there are a few things that I do know that renders them very questionable for use as some sort of standardized test. First off, you can choose which GCSEs you want to take, and there are average race differences in what GCSEs they choose to take. So it's literally not a standardized test in the first instance. Second off, in these exams, coursework counts towards one's GCSE score on some of the GCSEs you're allowed to pick. Coursework graded by the teacher at your school. And these schools, of course, want to be put up in league tables showing that they have the highest pass rates, and rich parents want to send their kids to the schools that have the highest GCSE pass rates or A-star rates. And third off, there's tiering. So even within the math GCSE, even within the English GCSE, you can take a higher or lower tiered math course, for example. And white people tend to take higher tiered everything. So it's not the same subject, it's not the same tiering, and there's coursework graded by teachers. Any one of these things is enough to disqualify the use of GCSEs as a proxy for general intelligence. And when we look at the UK universities, whites do better when you control for the A level going in. Now, A levels aren't GCSEs, but they're taken in the equivalent of junior and senior year of high school in the US, when we're about 17 or 18. And they're tests, but they're tests taken after a whole course, leading up to the equivalent of a final where you take your A level. And as BuzzFeed has so kindly shown us here, whites do better in university for any given A-level score. Being white is worth about 4 A-level grades, or about 1 1/3 full grade level per test, since most people only take 3 A-levels. In terms of predicting how well they do at university, being white is worth a little bit more than a full grade level. One thing that Vaush brings up and prattles on and on about is the supposed benefit from schooling. And of course, he just flies around with claims and speculation about the whole world because of what he thinks are the profound effects of variance in schooling. Now, I'm a bit more disciplined, so I'll just look at natural experiments that occurred in the United States that really address the variation in schools, quote-unquote good and quote-unquote bad schools within the United States. So there have been lottery voucher programs where parents apply to have their kids go to good schools, go to a quote-unquote better school, and it's random whether they get the voucher or not. Now, you can say, oh, this is a horrible program, it shouldn't be randomized like that. You can have whatever feelings you want about that, but the side effect is that we have basically a randomized controlled experiment. So with the Milwaukee program, there's data on math scores in 7th, 8th, and 10th grade, and the results show little benefit from vouchers. In 2006, the voucher group went from being 3.1 points lower in reading in 7th grade to 14.9 points lower in 10th grade. In math, it went from being 7.5 points down in 7th grade to being down 15.8 points in 10th grade. In 2010, in reading, they went from being up 6.8 points in 7th grade to only being up 1.5 points in 10th grade. And in math, they went from being up 1.6 points in 7th grade to being down 8.7 points in 10th grade. The Milwaukee program showed decisively that school choice at best has no benefit, and this actually could be used as evidence that it's harmful. The Cleveland program had similarly small effects, but in a positive direction. The voucher group started 9 points ahead in a standardized test in grade 1, ahead of the group that applied for vouchers but did not get one, and by 6th grade they were 16 points ahead. So we're looking at maybe a 4-point advantage from the school itself, as the voucher group was higher performing going into the study. There's also the Washington, D.C. voucher program, which compared the voucher recipients to voucher applicants, people who applied but did not receive vouchers. That's important. The voucher was given at the beginning of high school, and the test was done at the end of high school. The applicant group scored 2.36 points higher on math and 0.68 points lower on reading by the end of high school. So we're looking at negligible effects on differences in school, basically noise. And these aren't even IQ tests, because there's layers to this problem, right? If you're trying to establish good schools, quote unquote, as a reason for variance in G, in general intelligence, right? There's schooling, which gets one better at the kinds of information and skills that you're tested in school. And if you could, for example, show that quote unquote better schools teach these skills better, okay, next step, does that transfer to IQ? And then if you can show it transfers to IQ, okay, were the gains on IQ G-loaded or not? So you got to go through sort of the education skills to IQ, and then from IQ, those gains got to be G-loaded to get at G, which is what we're talking about, okay? Were the gains G-loaded, or were they hollow for G? So I just want to make it clear, because Vaush is making the claim that schooling raises intelligence in a generalized way, not just skills or nominal IQ score. And what I'm saying is that we can't even say that variation in school results in a variation in school performance, in standardized test scores and probably grades, let alone IQ, let alone underlying general intelligence factor. We can't even scratch the surface of immediate performance, let alone the core of underlying general intelligence. Of course, this probably goes against a lot of beliefs people have about the importance of good schools, because you spend a lot of time of your life listening to teachers. And guess what? Teachers will tell you that the school that you're in is really important. They're telling you that basically their job is really important. Right? They're there sitting in front of you, lecturing you all day, and then telling you, oh, by the way, what I'm doing here is super duper pooper important. It's the foundation of civilization and all that. Right? They also probably got you to believe that they're underpaid, and pointing to other professions that make more money than they do and say that's really unfair, that teachers are really underpaid and they should be paid more. And you probably believe that, right? And that the work they do is really important. Imagine spending 12 years working with plumbers and then coming away thinking that plumbers were underpaid and that plumbing was the foundation of a civilized society. Well, we would recognize what's going on. You've sort of been in with this group, and so you sort of see them as more important than they really are. But with teachers, apparently, we don't have those sort of logical skepticism towards that. Now, of course, I'm sure you'll say that this is a false analogy because there are big differences between teaching algebra and plumbing, which of course there are. There are pretty big differences between algebra and plumbing. One key difference is that you actually use plumbing, whereas most of what you learn in school you never actually use. I mean, boy, I sure do use the toilet a lot more than I use algebra. I mean, it's funny, but it's also just true. Now, regarding biological race differences, the evidence is overwhelming that humans have divergent evolution, the economic inequality is inevitable between the races, and for a multiracial society to function, everyone must come to tolerate an unprecedented level of economic inequality, not only generally, but between racial groups. And as societies become more multiracial, there must become more tolerance for economic inequality. The only alternative is radical wealth redistribution schemes or opportunity redistribution schemes, which is to say, racial discrimination against Europeans. But instead of understanding the problems and trying to come up with a solution to these problems, we have an entire political movement dedicated to both increasing racial diversity and reducing tolerance for the inevitable inequality that results. And these people call themselves many self-congratulatory names, like a child calling themselves the good guys. They call themselves liberals, progressives, the left, and some even just straight up calling themselves the supporter of good things as opposed to bad things. But the consistency in all of their thinking is anti-white racism and support for the establishment. When your policies are shared by Burger King, by Google, by the entire Democrat Party and half the Republican Party, Vaush, which is owned by Comcast, by Nike, even the Pope, maybe it's time to ask yourself, am I the baddie? Am I maybe the bad guy on these things? When the Pope, the papists are on your side, maybe that should be a sign that you're not on the side of truth. I mean, the Catholic Church has a pretty good track record of always being wrong. These people call themselves the left, but they are enemies of the labor movement. One of the ways labor has historically been able to organize is through regional restriction of supply and through tariffs. This forces firms to employ people in a certain country, and even within a certain part of the country sometimes, and they can't just export to other countries willy-nilly, picking and choosing who to hire and who to sell to. If you want to sell something in Hungary, for example, you would have to make a deal with organized Hungarian labor. If you wanted to sell something in Mexico, you had to deal with organized Mexican labor, in all likelihood make it in Mexico. If you wanted to produce something in Mexico, it would have to be cheap enough that Mexicans could afford it, and you had to negotiate living wages with the employees. The point of the factory was for the good of the people in that area. But when you have open borders, you make it impossible for labor to organize. And so labor is deracinated, it's spread apart, everyone's acting individually while the employers and the capitalists are acting collectively, and they just get chewed up and spit out by capitalists. Smaller firms, which don't compete globally, cannot compete. Small firms cannot compete on price with Nike in shoe production, for example, and so all the markets consolidate into those firms which can engage in global labor exploitation most easily, which tend to be larger firms. Now, worker control of means of production isn't some strict rule or binary thing. It falls along a continuum. There are degrees of worker control. I'm a pragmatist. A small business is closer to that ideal than a large firm is. And Latin America is just getting raked over the coals by global capitalism and free trade. So what is Vaush functionally doing? He's supporting the most vulgar form of capitalism. He may say he's anti-capitalist, but in practice, he's pushing a capitalist agenda by supporting the deracination of labors and destroying the ability of labor to organize. If you think that what I'm doing here is some sort of intellectual trickery, well, this is what Bernie Sanders used to believe before he ran for president, before he became co-opted by the Democrat Party establishment. He would say, open borders is a Koch brothers idea.
Up to a level of open borders, about sharply increasing the amount of foreign aid. Open borders.
That's a Koch brothers proposal. The
Really?
idea, of course, I mean, that's a right-wing proposal which says essentially there is no United States.
But it would make a lot
me.
of global poor richer, wouldn't it?
And it'd make everybody in America poor. Then you're doing away with the concept of a nation state. And I don't think there's any country in the world which believes in that. If you believe in a nation state, or in a country called the United States, or UK, or Denmark, or any other country, you have an obligation, in my view, to do everything we can to help poor people. What right-wing people in this country would love is an open border policy. Bring in all kinds of people who work for $2 or $3 an hour. That would be great for them. I don't believe in that. I think we have to raise wages in this country. I think we have to do everything that we can to create the millions of jobs. You know what youth unemployment in the United States of America today? If you're white, a white kid, high school graduate, 33%, a Hispanic, 36%, African American, 51%. You think we should open the borders and bring in a lot of low-wage workers? Or do you think maybe we should try to get jobs for those kids? So I think from a moral responsibility, we've got to work with the rest of the industrialized world to address the problems of international poverty, but you don't do that by making people in this country even poorer. So those are steps forward. I'll tell you, what my concern is the provisions dealing with the guest worker programs. Real unemployment in America, counting those people who have given up looking for work and are working part-time when they want to work full-time, you know what it is? close to 14%. Now, if you have, and it's higher for young people, it is higher for people of color. You have in this bill guest worker programs that will bring in hundreds of thousands of entry-level workers. Television, you hear these guys talking about all the PhDs are coming into this country. Hundreds of thousands of entry-level workers to work in kitchens, waiters, waitresses, lifeguards, ski resort workers. Is it really true that we can't find American workers to do those jobs? Frankly, I don't believe it. So as a nation, I'm very proud that we got a 2-year youth employment program which provided about 400,000 jobs for young Americans. That's very important. But you're right, given the magnitude of the problem, it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. So as a nation, we have got to ask ourselves, do we really need, when you go to ghettos in this country, when you go to inner cities, you have 30, 40% unemployment. Do we really need hundreds of thousands of workers, entry-level workers from around the country coming in competing against these kids? I think not.
And he was right. Labor unions, for example, used to all be anti-immigration. Now they don't seem to really care about labor at all. We can argue the facts on this in another video. This video is already super long, but the proof is in the pudding and that the capitalists smile on people like Vaush, if not Vaush in particular, people with a viewpoint of Vaush, and they really hate people who want to restrict immigration and want to support tariffs and want to support a kind of people's economy. The establishment racists also fancy themselves anti-theists, and maybe some of the rank and file are, but in practice they are promoting the rise of Islam, which is today in practice a far more fundamentalist religion than Christianity. Not talking about scripture or what this or that verse says, that's irrelevant, as religionists will pick and choose whatever they want, but the reality is that Islam is more constricting on the rights of women, homosexuals, and even straight men, and it diverts the masses away from their own exploitation in the Arab world in Indonesia, for example, just as it did in Russia in the past. They support institutional racism against the global minority of Europeans, support the dispossession of particularly Europeans, and it is a specific racial target. They have no problems with other forms of outright racial supremacism, something which even the boogeymen alt-right don't support, and they have falsified history in order to justify this hypocrisy. To say white nationalism is something inherently aggressive and evil, but black supremacism is a reaction to being so put upon. And if you try to challenge them on this hypocrisy, to say that this is a bogus attempt at justifying a racist double standard, well then they call you a Nazi historical revisionist. They support the agenda of the Koch brothers. They continue to support Obama after he passed laws forcing poor people to buy insurance, a demented and evil scheme pioneered by Mitt Romney. Like the Nazis and the Soviets, they deny heredity and promote racial revanchism. So what are they? They are ultra-capitalists, promoters of religious fanaticism, enemies of labor and the working class, Nazi-style deniers of heredity and promoters of racial hatred, and institutional racism from the universities to the firm. In a sane world, we would have a very easy word for them: the far right. We would say they are the far right, even down to their personality. The way they argue, the way they think, is by appealing to authorities. They have that authoritarian view of knowledge. What do the experts, what do the people with the credentials in my place and my time in history say? And that's what they believe. I should be able to call people like Vaush the far right, but to avoid confusion, I will use the term establishment racist. He is an establishment racist, an ultra-capitalist, theocratic racist who does the bidding of the establishment. And these people should be treated as such. Their speech should be treated as a form of hate speech, as a form of dangerous speech, and we should seek to remove them from any position of influence until they are de-radicalized. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you wish, you can support me on Subscribestar, or you can support my friend Cool Tapes on Patreon, who posts a cool picture whenever I upload a video on YouTube. Subscribestar is a monthly. I'm never not working on a video, even if there's a big delay. I wanted this video to Vaush to hopefully be one of the first things that comes up when you search his username, so fingers crossed on that. Possible upcoming videos: Black Privilege During Jim Crow, a realistic assessment of slavery in the United States, and Understanding the Establishment Racists.